On the morning of the 12th of August 2000, a huge fleet of 33 of Russia's most advanced naval warships gathered in a specific part of the Barents Sea. This sea is a massive 800-mile stretch of freezing, unforgiving water in the Arctic Circle, just northwest of Russia. These 33 ships weren't there by accident. They were there for a massive military training exercise. The plan was to run through a series of war game scenarios. For example, one ship would play the role of an enemy, and the other ships would practice locking onto it with their targeting systems and firing at it. But of course, they weren't using live ammunition. They were using dummy torpedoes and missiles, the kind that don't actually explode. Around 9 in the morning, the man in charge of this entire operation, Admiral Popov, gave the first command. He was on board one of the 33 ships overseeing everything. He authorized one of the submarines out there to shoot 2 of its dummy torpedoes at a designated target. The target was just one of the other ships pretending to be the enemy. As soon as he gave that order, the multi-day exercise officially began. All day and all through the night, these ships ran their drills, simulating combat and testing their systems. By the next morning, a full 24 hours into the exercise, Admiral Popov stepped away from the action for a bit. He had a scheduled call with some Russian reporters. During this interview, he told them that so far, the training exercise was going exactly to plan. He painted a picture of success, saying that it looked like it was going to be a huge achievement for the Russian Navy. But there was a problem. At the very same time that Admiral Popov was on the phone telling reporters how well everything was going, a rumor started to spread among the families of the crewmen who were out on the Barents Sea. The rumor was that the exercise was not going to plan at all. In fact, the word was that something terrible had happened to one of the ships. None of the family members had any concrete information. It was just a whisper, a feeling of dread that was passed from one person to another. But even though it was just a rumor, it was enough to cause serious worry. That morning, families began calling the naval base where the 33 ships had departed from, desperate for any information. At first, the phone operator at the base who was taking all these calls stuck to the official story. She told the frantic family members that no, nothing was wrong. She hadn't heard anything about any issues. But as the calls kept flooding in, the operator eventually let something slip. She admitted that she had also heard the rumor that something bad had happened, and she thought it might actually be true. One of the family members on the line heard this and immediately pressed the operator for more details. But at that point, the operator clammed up. She said she couldn't give out any more information and ended the conversation. So, the family member hung up the phone and did the next logical thing. They called the media. They told the reporters what was going on, about the rumor, and the operator's strange admission. As soon as the media had this story, they went straight back to Admiral Popov. They asked him directly if he could address the rumor, but he didn't. He gave no response to any of their questions. In a strange way, his silence was a little reassuring to some of the families. They figured that if Admiral Popov was just ignoring the rumor and staying out there on the Barents Sea, continuing with the exercise, then surely nothing truly bad could have happened. So, for the rest of that day, which was a Sunday, the families and the media just waited. There wasn't much else they could do. They had to wait for new information to come out of the exercise. The next day, on Monday, the 14th, 48 hours after the training had started, there was finally news. Russian officials went on television to formally address the rumor. And they said, yes, it was true. Something had happened during the exercise. They explained that the Kursk, which was the name of one of the submarines participating in the drill, had experienced some minor technical difficulties. They said these difficulties had forced the submarine to ground itself on the bottom of the Barents Sea. But they quickly added that everyone should remain calm. This was a normal procedure, they said. They were in radio contact with the crew, everybody was fine, and they were already pumping air and power into the submarine. They assured the public that before long, they would have the Kursk back on the surface. There was absolutely nothing to worry about. Naturally, the family members of the Kursk's crew panicked when they heard this. Even though the government officials sounded completely confident, the families did not feel confident at all. Their loved ones were trapped at the bottom of the ocean. But at the same time, they tried to hold on to a glimmer of hope. They remembered that the Kursk was not just any submarine. It was a very special and supposedly very safe vessel. The Kursk was, quite literally, Russia's best ship. No expense had been spared in its construction. It was incredibly expensive and absolutely massive, bigger than 2 football fields put together. It was built out of a specialized, highly reinforced steel that was designed to allow it to take a direct hit from a torpedo and just keep going without any major problems. The inside was also outfitted with all the latest and greatest technology. So, the thinking was, if you had to be stuck at the bottom of the ocean inside a submarine, you would want to be stuck inside the Kursk. And the families took some small comfort in that. But over the next couple of days, that comfort began to fade. Despite the government's constant reassurances in the news that everything was fine, that it was a minor issue, and that they'd have the Kursk up in no time, the submarine was still at the bottom of the sea. And the government wasn't giving the families or the media any new information. In this vacuum of information, the families began to panic again, and the media started to speculate. Did the Kursk really just suffer from minor technical difficulties like the government was saying? Or was this something much, much more serious? That question would be answered on August 21st, 9 days after the training exercise had begun. A Norwegian dive team had been brought in to assist with the recovery effort. They were able to dive down to the Kursk's location. They managed to get inside the submarine through an escape hatch. An escape hatch is like a small, watertight closet on the outside of the sub that allows people to enter and exit without flooding the interior. Once these Norwegian divers got inside the Kursk and had a look around, they were completely shocked by what they saw. While the exact details of what happened inside the Kursk are still debated to this day, and probably will be for a long time, there is one part of the story that is more or less universally accepted. And that is what happened inside of compartment number 9. The Kursk was divided into 9 separate watertight segments called compartments. Compartment 1 was at the very front of the submarine, and they were numbered sequentially all the way to compartment 9 at the very back. The reason we know what happened inside compartment 9 is because a 27-year-old crew member named Dmitry Kolesnikov told us Dmitry was born into a family of submariners. His father was a submariner, and his grandfather was a submariner. Growing up, Dmitry idolized them, and all he ever wanted to do was follow in their footsteps. In the late 1990s, his dream came true. He was commissioned as a naval officer in the Russian Navy and was given orders to serve aboard the Kursk. Just 4 months before this fateful training exercise, Dmitry met and quickly married a high school teacher named Olga. Right after their wedding, one of the first things he did was bring her on board the Kursk for a personal tour. Olga brought a video camera with her and filmed the entire tour. On that video, Dmitry is all smiles. He's so happy leading her around the ship, introducing her to his crewmates, and showing her all the cramped spaces on board. It's incredibly obvious from the video that Dmitry was so proud of his job, and even more proud to be sharing that part of his life with his new wife. Fast forward to the 12th of August 2000. Dmitry, along with 117 other crew members, had just arrived at their designated location in the Barents Sea for the exercise. At 11:27 inches the morning, the captain of the Kursk came over the radio. He spoke to Admiral Popov, who was on a separate ship. The captain informed the admiral that the Kursk was about to fire its 2 dummy torpedoes. After that call was made, the crewmen in the first compartment of the Kursk, at the very front of the sub where the torpedoes were stored, began loading the two dummies into the tubes. Meanwhile, Dmitri was all the way back in the seventh compartment. This was the engine room, and it was where he was stationed. In fact, he was the officer in charge of everyone who worked in compartment 7. So, as the two dummy torpedoes were being loaded up front, Dmitri and his men were at their posts, twisting dials and pulling levers, running through their checks. All of a sudden, there was a really loud crashing sound. Then the entire ship shuddered violently and jolted hard to one side, as if a giant hand had grabbed the front of the submarine and twisted it. What Dmitri and the men in the seventh compartment couldn't possibly have known was that one of the real live torpedoes in the first compartment had malfunctioned, and it had just exploded. But because of how well built the Kursk was, how strong its reinforced hull was, the torpedo explosion, just as advertised, did not puncture through the outer wall. It did cause a lot of damage and started a massive fire, but the sub was not yet sinking. Back in the seventh compartment, Dmitri picked himself up from the floor. Alarms were blaring, and everything was total chaos. Everyone was shouting, asking what was going on. Dmitri took charge. He ordered his men to follow their emergency protocol, which was to seal the watertight doors of their compartment. In this case, he sealed the door leading to the sixth compartment in front of them and the door leading to the eighth compartment behind them. There are a lot of reasons for this protocol, but the main one is to contain damage. If there's a leak somewhere else on the submarine, sealing off your compartment protects you from being flooded. As Dmitri and his men were turning the heavy wheels to seal the two doors, they would have started to see and smell smoke pouring in through the ventilation ducts. This smoke was coming from the uncontrolled fire that was now raging at the front of the submarine. They also would have felt the submarine suddenly pitch upward at a very steep angle. The captain of the Kursk was desperately trying to surface. But before they could reach the surface, that uncontained fire reached the other live torpedoes, and it set off an almost instantaneous chain reaction of explosions. This second collective blast was catastrophic. It killed virtually everyone in the front half of the submarine. Either the blast itself blew them apart, or they died moments later when the hull was finally breached. This second explosion was so powerful that it did puncture the walls of the sub, creating a huge hole in the front. Icy Arctic water began flooding in at an incredible rate. So if you weren't killed by the blast, you very quickly drowned. The only people who survived the first and second explosions were those in the sixth compartment and further back. So compartments 6, 7, 8, and 9. Dmitri and the other men in the seventh compartment would have been badly shaken up by that second explosion. It would have rocked the submarine and sent them tumbling all over the place. But they were still alive, and they were very aware of the terrible situation they were in. I would imagine that Dmitri and the others tried to grab onto any piping or equipment they could as the submarine, its control room now destroyed, just angled straight down and began to plummet towards the ocean floor. At 11:32 a.m., just 4 minutes after that initial explosion, the Kursk slammed nose first into the seabed 350 feet below the surface. And then the back half of the submarine settled down to rest. We don't know exactly what happened on board the Kursk for the first 2 hours after it hit the bottom. What we do know is that they had power. So there was light inside the submarine. Also, the air purifiers were still working, so despite all the chemicals and smoke in the air, it was relatively easy to breathe. We also know that at some point, Dmitri and the other men in his compartment must have heard banging coming from the sixth compartment. Remember, they had sealed off the doors to both the eighth and the sixth compartments. Hearing the banging, Dmitri made a decision. He decided to break emergency protocol. He opened the door to the sixth compartment to allow any survivors who were banging on it to come into their section. When Dmitri and his men opened that door and looked into the sixth compartment, they would have seen that it was rapidly flooding. It was also clear that most likely anybody forward of that compartment in 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1 was already dead. By 1:30 p.m., Dmitri and his men in the seventh compartment, along with the other survivors from the sixth, were forced to retreat. They moved from the seventh compartment into the eighth, and then finally into the ninth compartment at the very back of the submarine. The flooding was getting worse. Even though they had sealed off their watertight doors, the walls themselves were no longer watertight. The huge explosion had sent shrapnel flying down the body of the submarine, puncturing holes in all the walls between the compartments. So it didn't matter if you shut your watertight door. Eventually, as one compartment filled up, the water would begin leaking through all the cracks and holes in the walls. Dmitri and all the men with him would have been very aware of this. By the time they all got back to the ninth compartment, there was nowhere else to go. The water was going to eventually reach them. They were doomed, unless they were rescued or unless they could get out through the escape hatch. Despite how absolutely terrifying this situation must have been, Dmitri remained calm. In fact, he was so calm that he pulled out a piece of paper. As he's sitting there in this cramped ninth compartment with 22 other men, he writes the date and the time in the corner. Then he begins to describe what had happened. He writes about an explosion and that he thought he and these 22 other men were the only survivors. He says they are now trapped in the ninth compartment and they have to wait for rescue. He also mentions that they had considered using the escape hatch, but apparently it hadn't worked. After Dmitri wrote this very neat, very legible, and very organized note, he folded it up and put it in his pocket. Then, for the next hour and a half, he sat there inside the ninth compartment with the 22 others. And then, the power went out. This plunged them into absolute pitch-black darkness. I mean, completely black inside of there. And because the power was out, the temperatures suddenly began to plummet. Then, the worst part, the water began seeping through the walls much faster. Dmitri and the other men would have known then that it was just a matter of time before the room filled completely with water. And there was nowhere to go. So, with the water rising all around them in the dark, Dmitri pulled that piece of paper back out of his pocket, and he added to the note, but this time his handwriting is barely legible. It's because he was probably suffering from hypothermia, so he would have been shaking uncontrollably. He also couldn't see what he was writing. In fact, he writes the words, "I'm writing blind," to indicate that it's totally dark in the room. In this second part of the note, which was dated and time-stamped an hour and a half after the first one, Dmitri indicates that he does not think he's going to survive. It's very clear that none of them think they're going to make it. Then, with the remaining space on the piece of paper, Dmitri writes a very loving and thoughtful message to his wife and his family, saying goodbye. And then his final words on the note are, "Regards to everybody. No need to despair. Kolesnikov." After he wrote this second message, he folded the paper up, put it back in his breast pocket, and then, in total darkness, listening to the sound of water rushing into the room, he and the other 22 damned souls prepared to die. We don't know exactly how long Dmitri and the other 22 men survived in compartment 9. But experts say the entire Kursk submarine was completely flooded about 8 hours after the initial explosion. One of the most heartbreaking parts of this whole story is that Dmitri and those 22 other men could have potentially been saved if the Russian response had been a little more urgent and coordinated. Despite 2 of the other ships in the exercise, including the ship that Admiral Popov was on, hearing and feeling the second massive explosion from the Kursk, nothing was done about it. It was reported, but no one really took any action. And then, when no one could get in touch with the Kursk after they had said they were going to fire their dummy torpedoes, everyone just assumed it was a radio problem. They figured the Kursk was fine and would be in touch soon. So it wasn't until later that evening that the Russian Navy even figured out there was a major problem, that the Kursk had effectively vanished. And then it would be several more hours before they even got a rescue submersible into the water and down to the Kursk's location. Once it was down there, the Russian rescue sub could not latch onto the escape hatch on the submarine. So even if there were survivors inside, they would not have been able to get out. For days, the Russians struggled to get inside the submarine and kept turning down offers of foreign aid from Norway, from America, and from Great Britain. Then finally, 9 days after the Kursk had sunk, the Russians accepted foreign aid. That's when the Norwegian dive team went down. They were able to open up the escape hatch relatively quickly. When they went inside the submarine, they saw it was completely flooded. There were bodies floating everywhere. And that's when, ultimately, Dmitri's body was found. And they found that note tucked safely in his breast pocket. Russia would go on to award the entire crew of the Kursk with the Order of Courage, which is a very significant military award. The families of the crew were each given 10 years' salary. They were also given free housing in any Russian city of their choice, and their children would all have their college educations paid for. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Sometimes the world presents us with mysteries and accidents that seem completely impossible. We think we understand how our daily lives work and that the rules of nature are predictable. But every now and then, a series of events collides in a way that no fiction writer could ever dream up. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories where the truth is far stranger than anything you could make up. Our first story begins on August 25th, 2010, at the Kinshasa International Airport in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Sitting on the tarmac was a Letlau 410 being refueled for what was supposed to be a routine 1-hour domestic flight to Bandundu, a province just east of Kinshasa. The pilots were 62-year-old Danny Philemont from Belgium and 39-year-old Chris Wilson from England. Both were highly experienced. Danny and Chris walked into the cockpit and began their pre-flight checks while the flight attendant prepared the cabin. At 11 in the morning, the passengers began to board. By 11:30, all 18 passengers had taken their seats. The flight attendant locked the cabin door, went to the cockpit, and told the pilots they were ready. The small plane began to taxi toward the runway. After the flight attendant demonstrated the emergency safety procedures, the plane took off at noon, rising smoothly into the African sky. The flight went exactly as planned for the first 50 minutes. But as the plane began its final descent toward the airport in Bandundu, something went terribly wrong. Residents of a small town southwest of the runway looked up and saw the plane falling through the clouds in a near-vertical nosedive. Within seconds, the plane crashed into a residential neighborhood. Miraculously, nobody on the ground was injured, but the impact was devastating. The pilots, the flight attendant, 17 of the passengers died instantly. There was only one survivor, a male passenger who was rushed to the hospital in a deep coma. An investigation was launched immediately to figure out what had caused such a sudden crash. Investigators combed through the wreckage, theorizing that the plane must have run out of fuel since there was no explosion or fire. But they found that the plane actually had plenty of fuel. Next, they recovered the black box, but the device was broken and had not recorded any cockpit audio. Investigators were completely stumped. Had the plane hit a bird in midair? Had the controls suddenly jammed? Was it a massive error by the pilots? There were no clear answers. But then, a few days after the crash, the lone surviving passenger miraculously woke up from his coma. When investigators sat down by his hospital bed, he told them a story so wild that they thought he must be hallucinating. He said that as the plane was making its final descent, the flight attendant was walking down the aisle to check on everyone. Halfway down, she suddenly stopped, gasped, covered her mouth, and ran back into the cockpit. The passengers who saw this stood up in their seats and looked toward the back of the plane. And that was when they saw a large, hissing crocodile crawling out of a duffel bag. It turned out that a passenger had smuggled the live reptile onto the plane inside his luggage, intending to sell it, but the animal had managed to escape during the flight. When the passengers realized there was a dangerous predator loose in the tiny cabin, absolute panic broke out. Everyone stampeded toward the front of the plane, trying to get away from the crocodile. This sudden shift in weight completely threw off the aircraft's center of gravity. The pilots suddenly felt the nose of the plane pitch down violently. Because all the passengers were crammed into the very front of the cabin, the pilots could not recover from the dive before they crashed. When investigators heard this, they remembered that a living crocodile had actually been found near the wreckage after the crash. In the Congo, exotic animals are smuggled onto flights with such regularity that passengers often recognize the smell and tell the pilots before takeoff, but this time, nobody noticed. Our next story is about a man who decided to escape the chaos of humanity altogether, choosing a life of complete silence that lasted for decades. In 1986, Christopher Knight was just 20 years old. He found the pressure of society and daily human interaction completely overwhelming. One day, without saying goodbye to his family or friends, he got into his brand new car and began driving north. He drove all the way to Maine, parked his vehicle on a quiet dirt road, left the keys in the ignition, and simply walked into the forest. He had no compass, no map, and no real plan, but he knew he did not want to be around people anymore. Just after midnight, on April 4th, 2013, this same man stepped out of his tent and into the freezing, pitch-black woods of central Maine. He was dressed warmly in a wool hat, a new jacket, jeans, and high-quality boots. He carried a heavy backpack and a smaller bag containing a flathead screwdriver and a few other simple tools. He adjusted his glasses and looked up at the sky, smiling. The forest was so dark that he could not even see his own hand in front of his face, but he turned and began walking into the thick, dense trees. The terrain in this part of Maine is incredibly rugged and dangerous. The forest is packed with huge, moss-covered boulders that are incredibly slippery, and the trees grow so close together that you can easily get stuck between them if you do not know where you are going. One wrong step in the dark could easily result in a broken ankle or a serious fall. Yet, this man walked through the pitch-black wilderness with total ease, navigating the obstacles as if he had memorized every single step. After an hour of silent hiking through the cold air, he reached the edge of a large body of water called North Pond. Keeping himself hidden within the tree line, he followed the shoreline until he reached a clearing. Right in front of him were dozens of quiet cabins overlooking the water. This was the Pine Tree Summer Camp. The camp was currently empty, which the man already knew because he kept careful track of the seasons and schedules of the properties. He stood in the shadows for several minutes, listening intently for any signs of movement. When he was certain the coast was clear, he stepped out of the woods and walked up to the camp's main dining hall. He made his way to the back door, pulled his screwdriver from his bag, and expertly popped the lock open. He stepped inside and pulled a tiny, low-powered flashlight from his pocket. He walked over to the pantry and began stuffing his backpack with candy, potato chips, and coffee. Once his bag was nearly full, he walked over to the walk-in freezer. He pulled a key from his pocket, which he had stolen during a previous visit, unlocked the freezer door, and stepped inside. He grabbed several frozen hamburger patties and hot dogs, stepped back out, and locked the freezer behind him. He took one more pass through the pantry, shoving extra candy into his jacket pockets, and headed back toward the door, confident that he had pulled off another successful raid. But what this man did not know was that the camp owners had recently grown tired of the thefts and had installed a silent motion detector right behind the ice machine in the dining hall. The moment the back door had been pried open, the sensor had triggered. It did not make a sound inside the building, but it sent an instant alert to the nearby home of Sergeant Terry Hughes, a local game warden who had been investigating a string of mysterious break-ins in the area. Terry jumped into his truck and sped toward the camp, arriving in less than 4 minutes. He parked his vehicle far away so the engine noise would not scare the thief. He ran through the woods on foot, staying hidden in the trees until he reached the back of the dining hall. He crept up to the window and looked inside. Terry saw a tall, thin man walking out of the walk-in freezer. The man did not look toward the window. Instead, he walked over to the pantry, turned on his tiny flashlight, grabbed a few more items from the shelves, and stuffed them into his pockets. Then, the man turned off his light, faced the back door, and began walking out. Terry quickly backed away from the window and hid behind a large tree overlooking the exit. He held his flashlight in one hand and unholstered his pistol with the other. He watched as the man barely cracked open the back door, slinked out of the opening, and began walking toward the woods. At that exact moment, Terry stepped out from behind the tree, shined his bright light directly into the man's face, drew his weapon, and ordered him to get on the ground. The man did not run or fight. He immediately lay down on the cold dirt. State police arrived just a few minutes later. They cuffed the man, placed him on a chair, and began questioning him. They asked for his name, but the man just stared at them in complete silence. They searched his pockets and his backpack, but they could not find any form of identification. They asked him again for his name, but he still refused to speak. Deciding to try a different approach, the officers removed his handcuffs, handed him a bottle of water, and simply waited to see if he would open up. Sure enough, the gesture worked. The man took a drink and began to speak, but his voice was incredibly slow and awkward, as if he had to think about how to form every single word. He told them his name was Christopher Knight and that he had been born on December 7th, 1965. Christopher told the officers that he did not have an address, he did not own a car, and he had never filed a single tax return in his life. He explained that he lived in a small tent hidden deep in the woods nearby. The officers asked him how long he had been living out there. Christopher paused for a moment, thought about it, and then asked them when the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster had occurred. The officers looked at each other, confused, and replied that it had happened in 1986. Christopher nodded and said that was the exact year he had walked into the woods. The officers were absolutely stunned. They realized that meant he had been living in the forest for 27 years. They asked him how that was possible and if he had any family, a girlfriend, or some kind of companion out there helping him. Christopher looked at them and said no, he lived completely alone. He added that the last time he had spoken a single word to another human being before tonight was in 1990. It turned out that Christopher was telling the absolute truth. For 27 years, he had gone to extreme lengths to make sure he remained completely cut off from the rest of society. Maine winters are famously brutal, with temperatures regularly dropping to 20 degrees below zero. To survive without being caught, Christopher refused to ever light a fire, because he was terrified that someone would see the smoke or smell the burning wood. When the nights got dangerously cold, he would force himself to stay awake all night, pacing back and forth inside his small campsite to keep his body temperature up. He never sang, never talked to himself, and never made a sound because he was worried a passing hiker might hear him. Over the course of his interrogation, Christopher confessed to committing over 1,000 burglaries during his 27 years in the woods. He told the police that he felt deeply ashamed of his actions. When he first went into the forest, he had fully intended to live off the land by hunting and foraging, but he was terrible at it. Facing starvation, he decided to resort to stealing easy-to-carry junk food, candy, and soda because they were high in calories. When the news of Christopher's arrest broke, the residents living around North Pond were completely shocked. For nearly 3 decades, families in the area had swapped stories about a mysterious force that seemed to haunt their properties, constantly stealing propane tanks, flashlights, batteries, food, sleeping bags, and books. Some people had even stayed up late with loaded weapons, waiting to confront whoever was sneaking onto their land, but they had never caught a glimpse of him. Over the years, the mysterious thief had been given a nickname, the North Pond Hermit. Ultimately, Christopher was sentenced to 7 months in jail, which he had already served while awaiting his trial. When he was released, he was placed on 3 years of strict probation. One of the conditions of his release was that he had to physically check in with a judge every single week, ensuring that he could not simply run back into the forest. When his probation finally ended, Christopher surprised many people by choosing to stay in society. In a rare interview, a reporter asked him what he had learned about the human experience after spending 27 years in total isolation. Christopher paused, thought about it, and then told the interviewer to make sure he got enough sleep. Today, he lives quietly in a small apartment and works a steady job. While Christopher Knight chose to isolate himself in the cold woods of Maine, there is another group of people who isolate themselves in an environment that is far more hostile and dangerous, the deep ocean. Saturation diving is one of the most hazardous jobs on the planet. These highly specialized commercial divers perform complex construction and repair work at depths of up to 2,000 feet below the surface. To understand the extreme danger, you have to understand the physics of deep-sea breathing. Underwater, they cannot breathe normal air because the pressure of the ocean is too great. Instead, they breathe a compressed gas mixture of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen. As they breathe this mixture during their dive, their body uses up the oxygen, but the helium and nitrogen are absorbed directly into their bloodstream and body tissues. As long as the diver stays at depth, these gases cause no harm. But as the diver begins to ascend, the water pressure decreases. This allows the dissolved gases to slowly escape from the blood and tissues. Helium is a fast gas, meaning the body absorbs and releases it quickly, but nitrogen is much slower. If a diver rises to the surface too quickly, the gases in their blood will not have enough time to diffuse out safely. Instead, they will rapidly expand and form bubbles inside the bloodstream, acting exactly like a warm bottle of soda when the cap is unscrewed. These bubbles block blood vessels, causing excruciating pain, paralysis, or death, a condition widely known as the bends. To prevent this, divers must perform decompression stops on their way back to the surface, stopping at specific depths for hours to allow the gases to safely leave their bodies. The deeper a diver goes, the longer those stops take. For example, a dive to 250 feet requires nearly 4 hours of decompression. If a diver is working at 2,000 feet, it takes over 33 hours to return safely. This time constraint presents a massive problem for the offshore oil and gas industry, which relies on deep-sea work. Bringing divers up and down every day is simply too slow. In the 1960s, a solution was created, the saturation diver. Instead of decompressing after every shift, divers live inside specialized chambers on the surface for weeks at a time. The air pressure inside these metal chambers is set to match the pressure of the ocean floor where they work. This keeps the divers' bodies fully saturated with helium and nitrogen, meaning they only have to go through one major multi-day decompression process at the very end of their entire job, which can last for up to a month. Living inside a pressurized chamber for weeks at a time is an incredibly taxing experience. Because the air they breathe is mostly helium, the divers' voices are pitched up extremely high, making them sound like cartoon characters. This creates a strange, almost comical contrast to the extreme danger of their work. Every conversation they have with the surface crew over the radio has to be put through a descrambler just so they can be understood. The air inside the chamber is also kept very hot and humid to prevent their bodies from losing heat too quickly, and everything they eat has to be passed to them through a small, double-door medical lock. When it is time for a shift, they step out of their living quarters and enter a spherical steel capsule called a dive bell. The dive bell is also pressurized to match the deep sea environment. The dive bell is sealed, detached from the living chamber, and lowered by a massive crane down to the ocean floor. The divers then exit the bell, complete their grueling and dangerous work in the freezing, pitch-black water, and return to the bell when their shift is done. The bell is hoisted back up to the surface ship, where it is clamped onto the side of the main living chamber. Because the pressure inside the bell matches the pressure inside the chamber, the divers can safely open the doors and walk back into their living quarters to eat, sleep, and relax, without ever experiencing a change in pressure. While the system is highly advanced, it is incredibly dangerous, which is why saturation divers are some of the highest paid workers in the world. The job requires a level of mental and physical toughness that very few people possess. When these divers step out of the dive bell, they are completely alone in a freezing void. They are thousands of feet below the surface. They have only a single light on their helmets, which can barely penetrate 10 feet into the absolute darkness. They are operating heavy, dangerous machinery while massive marine animals swim around them. If they were to slip and detach from the umbilical line that connects them to the dive bell, they would sink instantly into the abyss, and no one would be able to rescue them. Some divers have died from panic, while others have suffered fatal seizures after being supplied with the wrong mixture of breathing gas. But the most famous and horrific accident in the history of saturation diving occurred on November 5, 1983. 4 experienced saturation divers were working on the Byford Dolphin oil rig, which was stationed in the North Sea. It was just after 4 in the morning, and the deck of the rig was cold and dark. Inside the pressurized living chamber on the deck, 2 of the divers, Edwin Coward and Roy Lucas, were relaxing in their bunks. The other 2 divers, Bjorn Bergensen and Troels Hellevik, had just finished a long, exhausting shift on the ocean floor. They had returned to the dive bell, which had been hoisted up by the crane and placed on the deck of the rig. 2 dive tenders, William Cremond and Martin Saunders, were standing on the deck preparing to connect the dive bell to the main living chamber so Bjorn and Troels could go inside and rest. The process of transferring the divers required absolute precision. The pressure inside the dive bell and the living chamber was 9 times greater than the normal atmospheric pressure on the deck of the ship. To make the transfer safe, the divers had to walk through a short tunnel connecting the bell to the chamber. Once they were inside the chamber, they had to close and tightly seal the inner door. Only after that door was completely sealed could the tenders on the outside unlock the heavy metal clamp that held the dive bell to the chamber. Bjorn and Troels walked in. They were in the middle of closing the heavy inner door when, for reasons that have never been fully explained, the outside tender, William Cremond, made a catastrophic mistake. Before the inner door was fully closed and sealed, William released the massive safety clamp holding the dive bell to the chamber. The moment the clamp was released, the unbelievable pressure difference created a massive vacuum. The high-pressure air inside the chamber exploded outward into the low-pressure atmosphere of the ship deck with unimaginable speed and violence. The force was so immense that it fired the heavy steel dive bell across the deck like a bullet, instantly killing William Cremond and severely injuring Martin Saunders. Inside the chamber, the 4 divers experienced instantaneous, explosive decompression. The air was violently ripped from their lungs, and their blood boiled instantly as the gases in their systems expanded. Troels Hellevik was sucked through the tiny door gap and killed. All 4 men died in a fraction of a second, spared from any prolonged suffering by the sheer speed of the physics involved. These 3 stories, though completely different in their settings and details, remind us of how fragile our control over our lives really is. A single unexpected passenger on a flight, a quiet man seeking peace in the woods, or a split-second mistake on an oil rig can change everything in an instant. The families of the victims of the Byford Dolphin disaster fought for decades to understand exactly what went wrong and to secure better safety standards for divers, ensuring that such a tragedy would never happen again. On the morning of the accident, the wind was howling across the North Sea, and the waves were crashing violently against the massive legs of the Byford Dolphin rig. The crew was exhausted after a long shift, and the pressure to keep the operation running smoothly was immense. The families of the 4 divers were left devastated, and for over 20 years, the official reports blamed the accident on pilot or diver error, protecting the companies from liability. It was not until 2008, after decades of relentless fighting by the victims' families and safety advocates, that an independent investigation proved a mechanical failure on the clamp mechanism had also contributed to the tragedy, finally clearing the names of the men who died. The mystery of the flight to Bandundu and the legendary tale of the North Pond Hermit remind us that truth is often far more complex, beautiful, and terrifying than any story we could write. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. It was just after midnight, specifically around 12:30 in the morning on August 9th, 2013, when Kyle Lawson was woken up by his cell phone ringing. He was in bed with his wife at their home in San Angelo, Texas, and the sound cut right through the quiet of the night. Kyle groggily reached for the phone, squinting at the screen in the darkness. The caller ID showed it was his younger brother, 26-year-old Brandon. That was a little strange, a call this late, but he answered it. Kyle put the phone to his ear, but before he could even get a hello out, Brandon's voice came through, frantic and rushed. He said he needed help right now. And then he launched into a story that sounded completely unbelievable. Brandon told Kyle that he was driving his truck north on Highway 277. Now, this highway is a classic West Texas road, just 2 lanes stretching out into what feels like a whole lot of nothing. It's desolate, especially in the middle of the night. There aren't many lights, not much traffic, just open, empty country. And according to Brandon, he wasn't alone out there. He said there were 3 men and they were chasing him. To make things worse, he told Kyle that his truck was about to run out of gas. He was on fumes. His voice was high-pitched with panic. He was practically begging Kyle. He needed him to bring a gas can out to him to meet him somewhere along the highway so he could refuel and get away from these guys who were on his tail. He stressed that Kyle had to be secretive about it, that he couldn't let the other men see him. As Kyle listened to all of this, lying there in his bed, he wasn't really feeling scared for his brother. At least, not in the way Brandon wanted him to be. He wasn't picturing a high-speed chase with dangerous men. Instead, Kyle's main feeling was just deep, heavy annoyance. He was almost certain that there were no 3 men. He was sure that his brother Brandon was just high again and was having a paranoid, drug-induced hallucination. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. You see, Brandon had a history with methamphetamine. It was a struggle he'd been fighting for a while. For the past 6 months, he'd actually been doing really well. He'd been clean, he was working hard, and he was trying to be a better partner to his fiancée, Ledessa, and a better father to his 4 young children. He seemed to be turning a corner, and the whole family was proud of him. But just 2 days before this late-night phone call, Brandon had called Kyle for a very different reason. He had asked Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Kyle, of course, didn't give him any information. He did the opposite. He pleaded with his brother, telling him, "Don't do it, man. You're doing so good. You're clean. Don't throw it all away." But Kyle had a sinking feeling that his words hadn't gotten through. He was pretty sure that even though he hadn't helped, Brandon had found a way to get drugs anyway. Because ever since that phone call 2 days ago, Brandon's behavior had been erratic and unpredictable. He just wasn't acting like himself. In fact, the only reason Brandon was even out on Highway 277 at this hour was because he'd gotten into a huge fight with Ledessa. Kyle knew this because he'd spoken to his parents earlier in the evening. The plan was for Brandon to drive to their parents' house to cool off for the night, to get some space. He was essentially in a timeout for his bad behavior at home. So him being on this specific road at this specific time made sense in that context. But the story about being chased by three men, that part didn't make sense at all. Not in the real world, anyway. So, Kyle knew his brother was almost certainly high. And he also knew that trying to reason with him in this state was a waste of time. Telling him, "Brandon, there's no one chasing you, you're just high, you need to go to mom and dad's house," would be pointless. Brandon wouldn't hear it. He was in his own reality right now. So Kyle shifted his strategy. He didn't argue. He just tried to calm his brother down, to soothe the panic in his voice. He used a low, steady tone, trying to be the anchor in Brandon's storm. But it wasn't working. Brandon didn't calm down. If anything, he got more agitated, more anxious. He kept talking about the three men, saying they were getting closer, that he was running out of time. The desperation in his voice was escalating with every word. Finally, Kyle just had to ask the question that was hanging in the air. He said, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed?" Is that what's happening here? As Kyle expected, Brandon completely denied it. He swore up and down that he was not high, that this was real, that he was in serious trouble. He went right back to begging Kyle to come help him to bring the gas can so he could escape. "Please, Kyle, you have to hurry. They're going to get me. Just bring the gas. Please, man, come on." At this point, Kyle felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. There was no point in continuing this conversation. Part of him just wanted to hang up the phone, roll over, and go back to sleep. He had his own life, his own family, his own responsibilities. He was a husband and a father. He couldn't spend his life babysitting his younger brother through self-inflicted crises. But at the same time, underneath the frustration, Kyle loved his brother. They were very close. And even though he was 99% sure there was no real danger from these imaginary men, there was still a tiny sliver of doubt. And what if Brandon was in danger from himself? What if he crashed his truck or wandered off into the dark? Kyle sighed. He knew what he had to do. He made a decision. He told Brandon, "Okay, I'm on my way. I'll be right there." Then he hung up the phone. About 45 minutes later, Kyle was driving north on that same dark and empty highway, 277. His wife was in the passenger seat next to him, and their 4-year-old son was asleep in his car seat in the back. His wife had insisted on coming. She hadn't wanted him going out alone in the middle of the night to deal with his brother, especially not when he was in such a strange state of mind. So now, the whole family was out on this rescue mission. As Kyle drove, he scanned the darkness on both sides of the road. This part of Texas is wide open. Even at night, you can see for a long way. The landscape is mostly flat plains, dotted with some low shrubs and a few small trees. It's the kind of place where a set of headlights or taillights would be visible for miles. It would be very easy to spot another vehicle. But Kyle saw nothing. There were no other cars. There was no truck that looked like Brandon's. There was certainly no sign of 3 other men in pursuit. The road was completely empty. He just kept driving, peering out into the darkness, checking the fields on either side just in case Brandon had somehow veered off the road. That seemed like a real possibility given the state he was in. But there was nothing. Then, finally, way up ahead, he saw it. A dark shape parked on the shoulder, half on the pavement and half on the dirt. It was a truck. The lights were off. It wasn't running. It was just sitting there, silent in the night. As Kyle got closer, he could see that it was his brother's truck. He'd found him. Kyle pulled his own car over to the opposite side of the road and parked. He turned to his wife and told her to stay in the car with their son, to lock the doors. He said he was just going to go over and talk to Brandon. In his mind, he was picturing Brandon sitting in the driver's seat, high as a kite, waiting for him. He figured he'd have a firm talk with him, get him to go to their parents' house, and this whole bizarre night would be over. The fact that there were no other cars around just confirmed his theory. The three men were a fantasy. But when Kyle walked across the highway and got to Brandon's truck, he peered through the driver's side window and his heart dropped a little. There was no one inside. The truck was empty. Brandon was gone. This didn't make any sense. Kyle was confused. On the entire drive out there, Brandon had been calling him repeatedly, call after call, his voice getting more and more frantic. "Hurry up, Kyle! You gotta get here! They're gaining on me! Bring the gas, man! I'm in trouble!" And now, Kyle was finally here, standing right next to the truck, and his brother was nowhere to be found. He hadn't said on the phone that he was leaving the truck. Where could he possibly have gone? Kyle started looking around the immediate area. He even crouched down and looked under the truck, feeling a bit ridiculous. Was his brother hiding? As he was standing there, trying to process this strange scene, his phone rang again. It was Brandon. Kyle, now deeply annoyed and confused, answered it with a sharp, "Brandon, where are you?" Brandon's voice came back, calm for the first time that night. He just said, "Bro, I'm right here." Kyle looked around wildly. "No, you're not. I don't see you. Your truck is here, but you're not." But just as he said that, Kyle saw a pair of headlights coming down the highway toward them. The vehicle was slowing down. As it got closer, he could see the light bar on the roof. It was a police car. A sheriff's deputy was pulling up to the scene. And as this was happening, as the police car was rolling to a stop right in front of him, Brandon's voice came through the phone with an urgent whisper. "Run away from that cop." In that split second, Kyle realized something important. Brandon had to be close by. He had to be watching this whole scene unfold. He could see Kyle, he could see his truck, and he could see the deputy arriving. But Kyle was looking all around him, out into the flat, open fields, and there was simply nowhere to hide. The landscape was barren. There were a few scattered shrubs and some small trees far off in the distance, but nothing close by that could conceal a grown man. So where was he? Kyle was getting furious. This whole thing was a ridiculous game. He knew why Brandon wanted him to run. Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest related to a drug charge. He was trying to avoid any contact with law enforcement. Kyle was already out here in the dead of night with his family in the car, trying to help his brother who was clearly not in his right mind. And now Brandon wanted him to run from the police? It was too much. Kyle was about to yell into the phone to demand that Brandon show himself, but before he could say another word, Brandon hung up. By now, the deputy had parked his cruiser and was walking over to Kyle, who was still standing next to his brother's abandoned truck. The officer introduced himself as Deputy Neal from the Coke County Sheriff's Department. He said he was responding to a 911 call from a truck driver who had reported a vehicle stranded on the side of the road. He asked Kyle if the truck belonged to him, if he was the one who needed help. Kyle knew he should tell the truth, but the instinct to protect his brother was strong. He couldn't just tell the deputy that his brother was likely high on meth, hiding somewhere in the nearby fields, and also had a warrant for his arrest. So, he made up a story. He told the deputy that the truck belonged to his brother, and that his brother had called him saying he'd run out of gas. He suggested that Brandon had probably started walking down the road to find a gas station. He then asked the deputy if it would be okay if he and his family just drove up and down the road a bit to look for Brandon. Surprisingly, Deputy Neal seemed to buy it. He just said, "Yeah, that's fine." Go ahead. So Kyle walked back to his car, got in with his wife and son, and started driving farther north, away from the scene. As he drove, he kept looking in his rearview mirror. He could see Deputy Neal still parked next to Brandon's truck. Once he was sure he was far enough down the road that the deputy couldn't see him, Kyle pulled over again. He took out his phone and started calling his brother, over and over and over again, his anger growing with each unanswered call. But Brandon never picked up. At this point, it was nearly 2 in the morning. Kyle's 4-year-old son in the back seat was awake and crying. He was tired and scared. Kyle's wife was exhausted, and Kyle himself had reached his limit. He looked at his wife and said, "That's it. I'm done." Brandon was an adult. He had tried to come out and help, to get him out of whatever mess this was. But if Brandon didn't want to be found, if he wanted to hide in a field and play these games, then that was on him. Kyle had a family to take care of. He was going home. He turned the car around and drove back south, right past the spot where his brother's truck was still parked. Deputy Neal was still there, standing beside it, presumably waiting for Brandon to return. Kyle didn't stop. He just kept driving, heading home to put his son and this crazy night to bed. He figured he'd hear from Brandon in the morning with some wild story to explain everything. He was frustrated, but he wasn't yet truly worried. A little while after Kyle and his family drove past, Deputy Neal decided he couldn't just wait there all night either. He'd done a quick search of Brandon's truck. There was nothing suspicious inside. But importantly, there was no phone, no wallet, and no keys. These were the things a person would take with them if they had indeed run out of gas and decided to walk for help. The story Kyle had told seemed to hold up. So, Deputy Neal figured Brandon was fine, just off on foot somewhere. He had other calls to respond to. So, he reached into the truck, turned on the hazard lights so it would be visible to other drivers, locked the doors, and then he got back in his own car and left. The next morning, around 8 o'clock, Deputy Neal drove back out to Highway 277 on his patrol. He wanted to check if Brandon had eventually made it back to his truck. But when he got to the spot, the truck was still there, sitting exactly as he had left it, its hazard lights still blinking. Now, a little bit of concern started to creep in for Deputy Neal. It was one thing to be gone for a few hours in the middle of the night. It was another to still be gone well into the next morning. It was possible something bad had happened to Brandon while he was on foot. Maybe he got lost, or fell and hurt himself, or maybe he was even hit by a car. Deputy Neal decided he needed to follow up to try and find Brandon and make sure he was okay. He drove back to the sheriff's department to look up contact information for Brandon Lawson. But as soon as he walked through the door, another employee stopped him. They told him that while he was out, the department had received a call from a woman named Ledessa, Brandon's fiancée, and the story she told was very different from the simple ran out of gas story that Kyle had given him. Ledessa explained that she and Brandon had been fighting. She confirmed that he was supposed to be driving to his parents' house to cool off on the night he disappeared. But he never made it to his parents' house. And he never came back home to her either. No one in the family had seen or heard from him since that night. They had all been calling and texting his phone, but there was no response. Brandon was officially missing. Hearing this, Deputy Neal was surprised and, frankly, pretty angry. He felt like Kyle had lied to him, that he deliberately downplayed the seriousness of the situation. His first move was to go and talk to Kyle and the rest of Brandon's family to get the full, unfiltered story. And it quickly became clear that the family hadn't been trying to hide a crime. They had been trying to protect Brandon from his warrant and from himself. They genuinely believed, just like Kyle did, that this was another drug-induced episode and that he would eventually turn up. But now that he was truly gone, their fear was real. They told the police everything they knew, including his history of drug use. They were begging the police to find him. And so, a massive search was launched. For the next 4 days, Deputy Neal led a huge effort covering the area around where Brandon's truck was found on Highway 277. They had teams on foot, they used search dogs, they even had helicopters in the air. Some of the search teams used thermal imaging cameras, which can detect body heat, making it possible to find someone even if they are hiding or unconscious. But despite scouring this vast open area, they found absolutely nothing. No footprint, no piece of clothing, no sign of a struggle. They also interviewed people who lived or owned property in the general area. They asked if anyone had seen a man walking, or a strange truck, Or maybe even the three men Brandon had claimed were chasing him. But no one had seen anything out of the ordinary. It was as if Brandon Lawson had simply vanished into thin air. Faced with a total lack of evidence, the authorities came to a conclusion. They believed that given Brandon's fight with his fiancée, his active arrest warrant, and the complete absence of any sign of him, he must have fled. They decided he was not a missing person in the traditional sense. He was a person who had chosen to disappear. He wasn't in the area because he had left on his own terms. And with that, the official search was called off. It seemed like an open and shut case of a man running from his problems. That is, until Ledessa, Brandon's fiancée, walked into the sheriff's station with a piece of paper that changed everything. It was August 13th, 2013, 4 days after Brandon had disappeared. The official search had just been terminated. An officer at the Coke County Sheriff's Department sat across from Ledessa, who looked distraught. She told him that she'd been so worried she had started digging into their shared cell phone records looking for any clue. And she had found something that terrified her. She slid a printed-out call log across the desk and pointed to a single entry. The officer saw that it was a record of Brandon's calls from the night he went missing. In between all the frantic calls to his brother Kyle, there was another one, made at 12:50 in the morning. Brandon had called 911. Ledessa explained why this was so chilling. Brandon was terrified of the police. He had a warrant. He would do anything to avoid them. She knew that he had even told his own brother to run from Deputy Neal that night. For him to voluntarily call 911 himself, she said, meant that he must have believed his life was in immediate mortal danger. He must have been out of all other options. It made no sense that he would call for help and then seemingly run away from it. This was a complete shock to everyone at the sheriff's department. Up until that moment, they believed the only 911 call had come from a trucker reporting a stranded vehicle. They had no idea that Brandon himself had also called for help. It turned out that the local 911 dispatch center was a small, underfunded operation. In the confusion of the night, someone had simply failed to pass along the information about Brandon's call to the responding deputies. It was a critical error. Now that they knew about it, they had to hear it. They contacted the dispatch center and got a copy of the audio recording. When they played it, a chill went down their spines. First, Brandon's voice. He did not sound like someone who had simply run out of gas. He sounded like he was in the middle of a life-or-death situation. He was breathless and panicked. But the second thing, the most disturbing thing, was that if you listened very, very closely, you could hear what sounded like another person's voice in the background, on Brandon's end of the line, right before the call disconnected. The call went like this. The dispatcher answered, 911 emergency. Brandon's voice came through, choppy and fast. Yes, I'm in the middle of a field. A state trooper is pushing guys over. Right here, going toward Abilene on both sides. His words were jumbled, hard to understand. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got chased into the woods. Some guys, the dispatcher, confused, said, okay, now run that by me one more time. Brandon then seemed to be talking to someone else, not the dispatcher. He said, we're not talking to him. Then, to the dispatcher again, I accidentally ran into them. The dispatcher asked, you ran into them. Okay. Then Brandon said something truly chilling. Got the first guy. The dispatcher asked, do you need an ambulance? Brandon replied, yeah. No, I need the cops. The dispatcher tried to clarify, okay. Is anybody hurt? But there was no response. Just silence. Hello? 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 The line was dead. Suddenly, this wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. This might be a homicide. The reference to being chased, the other voice, the cryptic phrase, got the first guy, it all painted a much darker picture. The search, which had just been called off, was immediately resumed, but this time it was bigger, more intense. For the next full year, law enforcement and volunteers poured countless, but they found nothing. Not a single clue. He was just gone. Eventually, the case went cold again. The authorities may have moved on, but Brandon's family never did. LaDessa hired 2 different private investigators over the years. They conducted their own extensive searches, not just around Highway 277, but all over the state, following up on any potential lead. But they also came up empty. As the years went by, Brandon's disappearance became a well-known internet mystery featured on podcasts and television shows. Theories swirled. Maybe he was just high and wandered off, falling victim to the elements or wild animals. Maybe the 3 men were real and they had kidnapped and killed him. Or maybe the original police theory was right and he had successfully started a new life somewhere else. For 9 long years, there were only questions. Then, in January of 2022, a small group of independent searchers, volunteers who had become fascinated with the case, decided to go out to Highway 277 one more time. They went back to that same area that had been searched by hundreds of people with dogs and helicopters and advanced technology. And while combing through a field right off the side of the highway, these volunteers found what all the others had missed. They found an old, weathered pair of shorts and pieces of 2 white sneakers. They immediately called the sheriff's department. Deputies arrived, secured the area, and began their own meticulous search. Not far from where the clothes were found, they discovered it. A small fragment of a human skull. The remains were sent for DNA testing, and soon the results came back. They belonged to Brandon Lawson. You would think that finding his remains would finally bring some answers. But instead, it only deepened the mystery. The location where his skull fragment was found was incredibly close to where his truck had been parked. It was in the primary search area, the very place that had been gone over with a fine-tooth comb again and again for years. How could everyone have missed it? Remember, this isn't a dense forest. It's a flat, open West Texas field. It's hard to imagine how the remains of a grown man, along with his clothing and bright white shoes, could have gone unnoticed for 9 years. So where does that leave us? We're left with 2 impossible-sounding scenarios. The first option is that for 9 years, hundreds of searchers, professional canine units, and helicopters with thermal cameras all somehow missed Brandon's body, which was lying right there in the open field where they were looking. That he was there the whole time, and everyone was simply blind to it. The second option is that he wasn't there. That during those initial searches, Brandon's body was somewhere else entirely. But if that's true, it raises even more questions. Where did he go after that 911 call? And, most disturbingly, how did his remains end up back in that field nearly a decade later? We can reconstruct his last known movements. He argued with LaDessa. He drove off, likely under the influence of drugs. His paranoia escalated until he believed men were chasing him. He called his brother for help. His truck ran out of gas. He got out and made a terrifying 911 call where he spoke of being chased and mentioned he got the first guy. He saw a deputy arrive and warned his brother to run. And then he vanished. 9 years later, a piece of him reappeared, almost exactly where his journey ended. The discovery of his remains gave his family a painful partial closure. They finally knew he was gone. But the how, the why, and the who, if there was a who, remain a profound and haunting mystery. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. As the Sherman family unloaded boxes outside their new ranch beneath the enormous skies of rural Utah, something appeared at the edge of the property. At first, Terry Sherman thought it was a stray dog. But as the animal slowly walked closer, he realized it was a wolf. An enormous one, much bigger than any wolf he had ever seen before. What made it even stranger was the way it behaved. The animal showed no fear at all. It calmly approached the family and stopped just a few feet away, silently staring at them like it had been waiting for them to arrive. Years later, the Shermans would say this creature was the first warning. Because after moving on to that isolated ranch, they began witnessing things they could never explain. Glowing objects hovering over the fields, cattle vanishing without a trace, strange creatures moving through the darkness, and lights that seemed to open in the sky itself. What they didn't realize on that first day was that they had just moved onto what many people now call one of the most paranormally active places on Earth. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to your next big house party, but be sure to give them the wrong address. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman bought a 500-acre ranch in northeastern Utah. It was their dream come true. The property had been abandoned for several years, so they got it for a great price. They were cattle ranchers, and all that open land was perfect for their herd. They were so excited to start their new life. When they pulled up to the main house, they weren't bothered by the overgrown grass or the general state of disrepair. They were just happy to be there. But as they started looking closer at the house, they noticed some odd things. Every single window had a deadbolt on it. And every door, not just the ones leading outside, but the doors between rooms, had heavy-duty locks on both sides. Outside the front and back doors, huge metal pikes were driven into the ground with thick chains attached, as if someone had kept very large, very powerful guard dogs. At the time, Terry and Gwen just figured the previous owners were a bit paranoid, being so isolated out in the desert. It didn't seem like a big deal. So, on that first day, as family helped them move boxes from the truck, Terry spotted that wolf. It was still a ways off, moving toward them from a line of trees. Terry was a rancher. He was used to predators. He just calmly pointed it out to everyone. They all stopped and watched as it got closer. Terry noticed it was bigger than any wolf he had ever seen. He judged it to be at least 6 feet long. But it wasn't acting aggressively. It was almost slinking toward them, and as it got closer, it started wagging its tail. It acted like a big, friendly dog. The wolf walked right up to Terry's father and gently nudged his hand. Terry's father, almost without thinking, started petting it. The family just stood there, mesmerized. They didn't feel any fear. Then, just as casually as it arrived, the wolf turned and walked over to a pen where they had a few of their calves. One of the calves had its head sticking through the bars. In an instant, the wolf's friendly demeanor vanished. It lunged and clamped its jaws around the calf's entire head, trying to rip it right out of the pen. The family snapped out of their strange trance. Terry yelled and started firing his pistol at the wolf, but the bullets seemed to have no effect. He and his son ran over, hitting it with the back of an axe, trying to make it let go. The wolf completely ignored them, focused only on the calf. Finally, it gave up, let go of the calf, and started to trot away. Terry grabbed his high-powered rifle and shot it again. Still nothing. The wolf just ambled off into the woods and disappeared. Afterward, they all remembered a horrible, foul, almost chemical smell that lingered in the air. Terry and his son grabbed their guns and went to track the massive predator. They followed its tracks into a muddy patch of ground inside the forest, and then the tracks just stopped. There was no blood, no sign of the animal. It had simply vanished. This was their very first day. The entire family was on edge. They tried to treat it like a normal predator problem, something they had to deal with to protect their livestock. But in the back of their minds, they all knew that what they had seen was not normal. Around the same time, Gwen started having strange experiences that made her worry about her own mind. One day, she came home from the grocery store and put everything away. She went into another room for a minute, and when she came back, all the groceries were back in the bags on the counter. She was just stunned, wondering if she had imagined putting them away. Later that day, she hung her towel in the bathroom before taking a shower. When she got out, the towel was gone. She found it later hanging in a closet on the other side of the house. She seriously started to think she was having some kind of medical problem, maybe memory loss. But then Terry had a similar experience. He was out digging post holes for a new fence with a heavy 70-pound tool. He set it down to go inside for lunch. When he came back out, the tool was gone. He asked everyone in the house, but nobody had seen it. They searched, but it was nowhere to be found. A week later, while patrolling the property, he found it. The 70-pound tool was lodged high up in the branches of a tree, about 70 feet in the air, far from where he'd been working. When he told Gwen, she finally told him about the groceries and the towel. That's when the whole family started to get truly scared. They were isolated, things were happening that they couldn't explain, and those locks on all the doors suddenly seemed a lot more sinister. Soon after, Terry started seeing strange lights on his property at night. At first, he assumed they were headlights from people who had taken a wrong turn. But it kept happening. He started to think it might be illegal hunters. One night, he saw the lights and decided to confront whoever it was. He was angry and marched out toward them. But as he got closer, he realized there was no sound. No engine, nothing. A vehicle would have made noise on the dry ground. As he approached, the lights began to move away from him, still in total silence. Then, they floated up into the sky and vanished. Terry was left standing alone in the dark, completely bewildered. By the spring of 1995, things had gotten much worse. Their cattle were not only disappearing, but sometimes reappearing hours or days later, dead. They looked as if they'd been surgically mutilated with precise cuts and missing organs. At night, the family started seeing tall, shadowy figures walking around the house. They described them as humanoid, but with no faces or expressions. Sometimes, these figures would walk right up to the windows, place their hands on the glass, and stare inside. The family would have all the blinds down and every door and window deadbolted, but they could hear tapping on the glass and strange, unintelligible voices speaking just outside. Sleep became almost impossible. The kids started doing poorly in school. Gwen lost her job at the bank because she was so sleep-deprived. They were all at a breaking point. One evening, Terry was sitting on his porch with his rifle when he saw a new kind of light on the horizon. It was a bright orange orb. He raised his rifle and looked through the high-powered scope. He could see that the orb was like a window or a portal. Inside this glowing orange circle, he could see a bright blue sky, as if he were looking into a world where it was daytime. As he watched, a dark, shadowy figure crawled out of the portal and scurried away into the trees. Then, the portal just closed and disappeared. After that, they started seeing blue orbs. The family said these were the most terrifying things of all. Whenever a blue orb got close, it would create an overwhelming feeling of pure terror and anxiety. One night, Terry was on the porch when a blue orb appeared. His 3 dogs started barking and growling at it. Thinking maybe the dogs could scare it off, he let them go. The dogs charged toward the orb, chasing it into the woods. Terry watched as the blue light retreated into the trees, and for a moment he felt a small sense of victory. Then he heard his dogs start to yelp in pain. He was too scared to go check. He just ran inside and locked the doors. The next morning, when the dogs hadn't returned, he and his son went looking for them. In a clearing in the woods, they found 3 small circular patches of scorched earth. In the center of each was a pile of greasy ash. It was all that was left of their dogs. That was the last straw. Terry decided they had to sell the ranch. He contacted a local newspaper and told his story. By pure chance, a billionaire named Robert Bigelow saw the article. Bigelow was fascinated by the paranormal and had already created a scientific research team called the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS, to study it. He bought the ranch from the Shermans and turned it into the headquarters for his team of highly credentialed skeptical scientists and PhDs. Terry, wanting answers, agreed to stay on as the ranch manager. For the first year, the NIDS team conducted baseline tests. They checked the water for contaminants, the plants for hallucinogens, and did psychological evaluations on the Sherman family. They found nothing. During this time, the ranch was relatively quiet. The scientists concluded that the Shermans were not lying or hallucinating. They genuinely believed they were experiencing these things. Then, the activity started up again. One day, Terry and Gwen were tagging a new calf. They put a yellow tag in its ear and moved on to other animals. About 40 minutes later, their dog started growling and barking at the spot where the calf had been. They looked over and found the calf. It had been completely dissected, with only its head and legs remaining. The incisions were perfectly surgical, and there was no blood anywhere. The ear with the yellow tag had been cut off and was missing. The NIDS researchers swarmed the area. This was exactly the kind of event they were there to investigate. As they searched the property, they noticed that the guard dogs at their observation posts were all cowering, all staring in the same direction toward a line of trees. As the team got closer, Terry shouted that he saw something in a tree. They all looked and saw a massive, humanoid creature with wolf-like features perched on a branch. Terry fired his rifle at it, and the creature scrambled down and vanished into the woods. The team searched, finding a few massive tracks with huge claw marks, but just like the first wolf, the creature had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind that same foul, rotting smell. A few weeks later, Terry and Gwen drove past a corral holding 4 of their prized, expensive bulls. They were all there. The couple drove to another part of the ranch to do some work. When they came back a little while later, the corral was empty. The gate was still locked. There was no sign of a struggle. Panicked, Terry looked around and noticed an old, small trailer nearby that had been wired shut for years. On a hunch, he looked through a window. Inside, crammed into the tiny space, were all 4 bulls, standing perfectly calm, as if in a trance. The trailer door was still wired shut, with old cobwebs undisturbed. It seemed physically impossible for the bulls to have gotten in there. The NIDS team later discovered that a section of the steel bars on the corral had become highly magnetized. The most disturbing encounter the NIDS team reported happened in late 1997. 2 researchers were watching the ranch from a ridge when an orange light suddenly appeared near the homestead below. Through infrared goggles, one of them later described it as looking less like a light and more like an opening in the air. Then they saw something crawl out of it. A dark, human-like figure emerged from the glowing oval and sprinted straight up the hill toward them. As it rushed past only about 30 feet away, the men could hear rocks crunching beneath its feet and smell the same horrible metallic stench witnesses had reported for years. Seconds later, the creature vanished into the darkness beyond the ridge. After 1998, the activity at Skinwalker Ranch reportedly began to fade. By 2004, National Institute for Discovery Science shut down the investigation. Despite years of research, eyewitness testimony, strange magnetic readings, unexplained animal mutilations, and photographs of mysterious lights, they never found definitive proof of what was happening on the ranch. Many of the investigators later said the same thing. Whatever was out there always seemed one step ahead of them, revealing just enough to be seen, but never enough to be understood. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, see ya. As dawn broke on the 5th of February, 1990, 57-year-old Laverne Pavlone stood in her Wilsonville, Oregon apartment kitchen. The small apartment smelled like coffee, even though the sun wasn't up. Morning stillness was Laverne's favorite time. The only time she had the flat to herself and could breathe was then. She resided there with boyfriend John Sosnovsky. John always left before morning to take his bus to work at a local mill, where his shift started early. Laverne was relieved every time the front door closed behind him, like a weight had been removed. Since John wasn't home, Laverne could pretend her life was normal. She might act safe. She was merely acting for herself. Indeed, John was violent. He was severely physically abusive, especially when drunk, which was almost constantly. His fury was a regular storm in their home that Laverne had to navigate. Her first husband died of cancer. After his death, she met John when she was lonely and weak. She didn't realize John's true nature until she was already ensnared in his web. 10 long years. 10 years of treading on eggshells, hiding bruises, and dreading his key in the door. Laverne still lacked the guts to quit. She was afraid of what he would do if she attempted. He made it plain what would happen. Thus, she felt absolutely trapped at home. She made coffee and sat at her modest kitchen table that morning. As usual, she unwrapped the local paper. Her first sight was a large black and white photo of a young woman on the front page. The woman smiled, looking vibrant in her 20 seconds. The snapshot accompanied a murder story. About 30 miles northeast of Portland, it happened. Tanya Bennett was the victim. The smiling girl was Tanya Bennett. The article said she was viciously battered and strangled with a rope. Highway side, her body was left. Laverne got a chill reading about Tanya's discovery. That article indicated her body was dumped near a prominent scenic viewpoint. This place was familiar to Laverne. She'd been there before. About 1.5 miles from the lookout. Her mental image of the region was excellent. Laverne sat there, her coffee cold, her eyes flitting between the words on the page and Tanya's beaming face. As she watched, a thought formed. She felt strangely familiar with this horrific deed. She initially couldn't place it. She continued staring at Tanya's eyes in the photo. Then her brain switched on. She was sure she knew who did this when everything fell apart. John, her boyfriend, had probably killed this woman. Laverne got up from the table, even though she loved her quiet mornings. Her hands shook. She contacted the cops from her kitchen's wall-mounted phone. Laverne felt like her heart would explode after hanging up the phone. She was shivering uncontrollably. She took a huge risk. She didn't know if the police could arrest John with the information she gave them. If not, John would likely learn she called if they questioned and released him. He discovered she betrayed him and told police she thought he was a killer. If that happened, his abuse would worsen. She had no idea what he would do to her. Her view was that there were only two outcomes. She could either sever her relationship with John and send him to prison for a long period, or she could wind up like Tanya Bennett, another dead girl on a highway. On the morning of February 16, Detective John Ingram sat on a couch in a spotless Wilsonville, Oregon living room. He and his partner were in Laverne's apartment. As the lead investigator on the Tanya Bennett murder case, Ingram spoke with Laverne, who was sitting on the couch opposite him. She appeared anxious. She couldn't sit still, fidgeted, and gave him and his buddy coffee and water 3 times. Something was clearly on her mind. Ingram knew this woman had tipped a week before. Susan told the dispatcher she thought her boyfriend, John Sosnowski, killed Tanya. Now, Ingram was here to hear the whole story. He wanted every detail she could give because his case was hopeless. This Laverne tip was their only lead. Tanya's body was located on a grassy slope near the highway, where vehicles could see her. Yet, Ingram and his crew found no eyewitnesses. Several people claimed to have seen Tanya at a bar the night she disappeared. Nobody could describe the man she was with. Just a man. Ingram and his companion followed the rules. They contacted everyone who knew Tanya. They canvassed her neighborhood door to door. They interviewed her family, co-workers, and acquaintances. Despite that, they had no suspects. The crime scene provided scant evidence, making matters worse. They had no useful fingerprints, physical evidence, or forensics to identify a killer. In this clean apartment, Ingram was betting everything on Laverne. He hoped she would give him the case-opening key. He tried to smile at her to reassure her. "When you're ready, tell me what you know. Explain why you think John killed Tanya." Laverne initially squirmed in her seat. It was obvious she was nervous. Ingram advised her to breathe deeply and relax. He told her that was okay, they wanted her narrative. "Finally," she said with a trembling voice. She informed them John had come home late the night of the murder, possibly around 1 or 2 in the morning. He immediately entered the bathroom and showered. She said this was unusual. John didn't take 2 morning showers. It wasn't his habit. Laverne didn't think much of it at the moment. My understanding came the next day. They were at a local tavern when she overheard John. She heard John brag about murdering Tanya Bennett at the pub. He detailed how he picked her up at a truck stop, killed her, then drove her body to the highway by the Columbia River Gorge to dump her near that gorgeous viewpoint. Ingram and his companion looked at Laverne as he told the story. It surprised them. Laverne effectively overheard a confession. Her details matched what the cops knew. Tanya was observed late at night with an unknown male. Yes, her body was recovered near that gorgeous overlook. Although the body's location had been reported, hearing it as part of this confession was powerful. Perfect poker face, Ingram kept his face neutral. He nodded and calmly advised Laverne to keep on and tell him everything. So Laverne continued. She said she was afraid to speak up. John frightened her. She called him a violent alcoholic who abused her often. She stated this helped her believe his confession. That John could kill someone didn't surprise her. Violence was a daily threat to her. She was terrified he would murder her if she told anyone. So she hid this dreadful secret for days. But then she saw the newspaper article. Tanya seemed young and innocent in the photo. Laverne said she felt she owed the girl to speak up, no matter the risk. Ingram's mind was racing. If Laverne was right, this was a major case break. This may solve everything. This may have been Tanya Bennett's complete narrative. However, as an experienced detective, he understood he only had one woman's story. Even though she was convincing, he couldn't trust her. He needed tangible proof. So he requested Laverne to let him search the apartment. When Laverne nodded, the 2 investigators got up and started work. The detectives followed Laverne down a small hallway to the master bedroom. Once there, she stood by the doorway and let the men work. The detectives divided instantly. Ingram's colleagues started on one side of the room and Ingram on the other to maximize efficiency. Ingram presented a list of items they wanted to locate that could link a suspect to the crime site. A little denim swatch was crucial. It was Tanya's pants' front buttoned part. This portion was missing when they found her body. Interestingly, it was cut out cleanly. It made Ingram suspect the killer took a trophy or keepsake. Ingram didn't find the denim patch after several minutes of digging through the bedroom. At first sight, he saw no connection between John and Tanya. A cardboard box with old documents sat in the corner, so he went there. The random letters and receipts were sorted by him. He found it then. He took out a damaged scrap of paper. A handwritten message was there. "Good piece, T. Bennett." Ingram froze. He instantly summoned his partner. His partner looked down at Ingram's note as they crossed the room. Both realized the significance. T. Bennett must be Tanya Bennett. This was huge. They glanced at each other and thought the same. John needed to be talked to immediately. The door opened as they exited the bedroom, and walked to the front door to leave the flat. The gateway was manned by John Sosnowski. Detective Ingram was at the sheriff's interrogation table an hour later. John sat across. Although he was confused, John appeared calm for a man who had just found two detectives in his bedroom. Ingram introduced himself and explained why they were at the flat when John entered. John seemed astonished, but didn't argue. He readily consented to answer questions at the station. However, Ingram was an experienced detective. He realized that cooperation didn't prove innocence. Sometimes it implied the reverse. Ingram passed John a Tanya photo across the table. He asked if he knew her or was involved in her murder. John didn't rage, not denying it. He didn't seem alarmed by the inquiry. He said he didn't remember after looking at the picture. Ingram then showed him the T-written note they found in his bedroom. "Good piece, Bennett." John glanced at the page and wasn't sure if he wrote it. Simple, direct questions needed. Simple, direct responses. Ingram was suspicious that John couldn't answer them clearly. The interview continued as usual. No matter what Ingram asked, John would just give these vague, non-committal answers. He struggled to answer yes or no questions. Ingram was struck by John's nonchalance during the interview. He pretended to talk about the weather while being questioned about a terrible murder. This was no time for laziness. This was a time to be honest and defend yourself. Despite his gut sense and intense suspicion of John, Ingram realized his sole proof was circumstantial. A bizarre note and girlfriend tale. It was insufficient to arrest him for murder. They sought concrete proof linking John to Tanya. After the weird interview, Ingram groaned and told John he could leave. 4 days later, Ingram's desk phone rang when he arrived to work. He was astonished to hear Laverne's voice when he answered. Before he could ask why she was phoning, Laverne said she found something in her car that morning. She believed he needed to see it. And when she told him, Ingram instructed her to stay and he would be right over. He went to find his partner after hanging up the phone. His heart raced as he drove to Laverne's flat. The past several days were frustrating. No fresh evidence proved John was their killer. One piece of evidence was lost. The note in John's box of papers was useless. Their forensics lab couldn't identify John's handwriting, so they couldn't prove he wrote it. Based on what Laverne told him on the phone and what she found in her car, Ingram was almost certain this was the break he had been waiting for. Ingram and his partner met Laverne in her garage within an hour. All eyes were on her car's trunk. Laverne told Ingram she kept her car and life spotless. Her car and apartment were clean. Nothing was out of place. A little denim swatch was in her car trunk when she went out that day. She was certain she hadn't put anything there. With her suspicions of John and his link to the murder, she immediately thought she should report it to the police. As they gazed into that trunk, Ingram and his companion felt struck. The trunk's clean carpet held a little denim square with buttons. It matched the denim they were secretly seeking. A crime detail was kept from the public. Outside the investigation, no one knew the killer took Tanya's jeans portion. They found it in their primary suspect's girlfriend's car. This needed to be their break. That was Tanya's jeans denim. The call by Laverne was correct. This was huge. Naturally, Ingram understood they had to follow process. A lab test would be needed to determine that the denim swatch matched Tanya's jeans when she died. It could have been a coincidence from Laverne or John's jeans. But the conditions were too ideal. It felt like winning the lottery. Ingram watched his companion use tweezers to gently place the swatch in an evidence bag and seal it. They assured Laverne they would examine it immediately and contact her. Ingram reviewed their findings at his desk the next morning. They felt wealthy at this time. After locating the denim, they summoned John back for a polygraph test the night before. He failed totally. In his report, the test administrator stated that John knew what happened to Tanya. Ingram awaited one more piece of the puzzle. He awaited the lab's confirmation that the fabric matched. Once he got the call, they might arrest John. Then his phone rang. He grabbed it immediately. It was Lab. Ingram straightened his chair, anticipating good news. The other technician sounded down. He told Ingram that Laverne's automobile denim swatch didn't match Tanya's jeans. It wasn't hers. Ingram was stunned. He sat silently. The idea that they located the same unique denim cut in their prime suspect's residence by chance seemed absurd. Denim swatches from the front of jeans weren't common. It was too specific. There must be more to this story. Ingram attempted to figure out why the swatch was in her car, but nothing made sense. The only plausible reason was denim planting. As the thought hit, Ingram felt shocked and frustrated. He felt like he was starting over after thinking he was close to solving this case. He knew his next stop. He needed another Laverne conversation. Later that morning, Ingram and his colleague sat in Laverne's living room again. Laverne sat across from them, worried. But this time, Ingram would do things differently. He would punish her more. He knew her previous story was false. After sitting down, Ingram asked her directly. He stared her in the eye and asked if she planted that denim in her car. As soon as he said that, Laverne's face fell. After quivering her lower lip, she cried. She sobbed and apologized. She admitted to doing it. She chopped up an old pair of jeans and put the buttons in her automobile. She lied about finding it to get enough proof to arrest John. She was frightened when they let him leave after the first interview. She knew John killed Tanya. He had mentioned it to her. She wanted the cops to hold him accountable because he was dangerous. Ingram could tell she was sincere as she spoke. This woman was clearly afraid of John and feared he was a murderer. Even if planting evidence was wrong, he wanted to believe her motive. She had a major problem with her story. He knew Laverne was still concealing things. Because without inside knowledge of the crime site or other facts, she could not have planted that exact denim cut. Missing something. Why did she arbitrarily choose the front button fly of a pair of jeans to plant evidence? The pic seemed too detailed to be random. When he asked Laverne how she knew to cut that piece, her energy changed. The crying ceased. Sadness and regret vanished. It was replaced by hesitation. She seemed unsure how to react. It appeared she was caught. Then Laverne inhaled. She looked at Ingram and said, "I lied. You're right. My story about planting evidence was false." However, she claimed she lied out of fear. She worried the cops would arrest her if they learned the whole truth. Then Laverne detailed what she said happened to Tanya Bennett. Laverne alleged John called her the night Tanya was murdered. He sounded frantic. He informed her he was in trouble and to meet him at the bar. He instructed her to bring a shower curtain. Laverne said she didn't ask questions because John scared her. So she did as he said. She drove to the bar with a shower curtain from their bathroom. John was in the parking lot when she arrived. He stood over a corpse. It was Tanya. She lay unmoving on the cold pavement. Shocked, Laverne said. She had no idea what to do. She helped him. She helped John lift Tanya into her car trunk. The shower curtain she brought was wrapped around her. They drove to the highway and discarded her body at the picturesque overlook. Laverne's story darkened as she spoke. She later admitted that Tanya was alive when she arrived at the parking lot. She claimed Tanya was barely surviving. Laverne restrained Tanya's neck with a rope at John's request as he sexually attacked her. Laverne reported Tanya stopped breathing when he finished. Ingram was stunned as he listened. This gentle, soft-spoken elderly woman was suddenly telling him she actively engaged in the sexual assault and murder of a young woman. It was hard for him to comprehend. Ingram only thought, this can't be real. Laverne's claim fit. It clarified everything. It explained John's cagey interview answers, failed polygraph test, and, most crucially, how Laverne knew about the denim. She knew what area of Tanya's trousers to cut out and put as phony evidence because she and John had cut them originally. Despite this life-changing revelation, Ingram wanted to be sure this horrific, detailed account was true, and he knew how to prove it. The next day, Ingram drove his police cruiser. Laverne sat in the back, peering out the window, while his partner was in the passenger seat. They were driving northeast of Portland on the freeway. When they reached where she and John dropped Tanya's body, Ingram told Laverne to tell him. The newspapers had reported the body's broad location, but not its actual position. Ingram understood that if Laverne could pinpoint the place, she was telling the truth. Ingram's heart rate increased as they approached the spot. He maintained his speed. He didn't slow down or signal their approach. He kept driving straight, waiting for Laverne to speak. Laverne didn't say a thing as the cruiser drove by Tanya's body. They continued driving silently for a few minutes. Disappointed, Ingram was. This story seemed like another falsehood. Laverne suddenly spoke from the back seat. She said, "Hold on. Turn around." Ingram found a space to turn the car around, and they headed back. This time, Laverne yelled out as they passed the crime scene, the slope where Tanya was found. She claimed that was her location. "Stop." Ingram looked at Laverne as he pulled over to the shoulder. She stared out the window at the body's location. They exited the automobile together. Laverne crossed the road and pointed down the grassy slope to where Tanya had been found. Ingram was astonished. Laverne was honest. Her choice of location would have been difficult without having been there before. She must have participated. Ingram felt they had all they needed as they got back in the car. The evidence was sufficient to arrest John and Laverne. She had come forward, but now she would pay the price. Just 16 days after Laverne made her first anonymous contact, John Sosnowski was arrested on February 21. Laverne Pavlone was arrested 5 days later. Both were charged with murder. Laverne's trial began 11 months later. Laverne sought to amend her tale again. She sought to retract her statement, saying she hadn't done anything. The jury didn't believe her. She received a life sentence for murder. 2 months later, John received the same sentence, life in jail. The case should have ended there. But Detective Ingram couldn't stop thinking about it for 3 years. He kept thinking about Laverne, John, and Tanya Bennett. Though Laverne had done wrong, he felt weird pity for her. She was clearly controlled by John and afraid of him. But more than that, Ingram had this terrible, persistent sensation that they had messed something. Ingram was in his office one March 1994 afternoon when his desk phone rang. The prosecutor handled Tanya's case. The prosecutor said they received a bizarre Tanya murder letter. The prosecutor explained the letter's contents, making Ingram queasy. Ingram was correct to worry. The legal system botched this case. He felt loose and incorrect about Laverne. Their star witness was not a nice, older woman terrified of her abusive lover. She had not spoken the truth despite the implications. That was not her tale. She lied about practically everything to Detective Ingram and his partner. Laverne wanted to break up with John but was terrified. To get rid of him, she devised a complicated and deadly strategy. She framed him for murder. And initially, she excelled. She read every newspaper item she could find to memorize Tanya's murder's facts. She discovered the missing denim swatch by sneaking a look at Ingram's list of evidence during her first apartment interview. Some was dumb luck. She predicted where the body was located on the highway, but she was right. Her strategy failed because she accidentally implicated herself in framing John. She believed that the police would sympathize with her and perceive her as a victim of John's deception, resulting in his arrest. But that didn't work. She was convicted of murder and imprisoned with him. Laverne and John were serving life sentences for a crime they didn't commit when the true perpetrator, the man who murdered Tanya Bennett, wrote to the authorities admitting. That was the letter the prosecutor called Ingram about. Laverne and John were released in 1995 after the true killer was arrested. Laverne's falsehoods got them 4 years in prison. 71-year-old Patrice Miller stood in front of her refrigerator in her little home one morning in early November 2023. She lived in rural Downeyville, California. Since she was running low on a few products, she ordered from the local market. They delivered her groceries, which was great. Patrice needed food delivery at this point. She lived alone and found housework harder as she aged. She was also having health issues, making movement difficult. Even with a walking stick, she navigated the house. Patrice heard one of her two cats meowing outside the door while she was making her grocery list. This prompted her to feed them. Thus, she delayed her list. She headed out the door with her walking stick after closing the fridge and pouring cat chow into a bowl. Patrice brought her porch cat food bowl. She had other outdoor tasks, but her walking stick limited her to one. She returned inside to retrieve her kitchen compost bin after setting up her cat's feeding bowl. She returned to her garden. She finished these outdoor duties fast because she didn't like being outside anymore. She had lived in Downeyville for years, but it had become unsafe. Since she stayed to herself, she didn't realize how awful it was. She eventually heard from her neighbors that their properties were being invaded. Vandalism had increased, with yards messed up and residences broken into. After a few months, Patrice started experiencing it. After so many attempted break-ins at her house, she was convinced she had a stalker. She even installed metal bars on all her windows for security. Patrice disliked the outdoors because of that. She felt exposed and weak. She believed her stalker was following her and might attack her. She quickly dumped the compost in her garden, turned around and ran inside, locked the door. Once inside her residence, she breathed a great sigh of relief. A few days later, on November 8, Cassie Coe, a 55-year-old cashier, was counting up a client at Patrice's usual market. She bagged their stuff while thinking about something else. Patrice was on her mind. After years of delivering Patrice's groceries, Cassie had become more than a client and delivery lady. Friends? They frequently called to catch up. Cassie noticed she hadn't heard from Patrice in days. This was odd because of their closeness, and since Cassie knew Patrice hadn't ordered in a long. Cassie asked throughout the store, but no one had heard from Patrice. Cassie knew Patrice could be busy. Just about anyone else wouldn't worry about a missing order. Cassie was especially worried because she knew Patrice's stalker. She knew Patrice had phoned the police, but they weren't helpful. This tiny rural hamlet was inundated with these calls. Burglaries, harassment, vandalism. Nobody had reported actual violence yet. Thus, local officials were inundated with small complaints. Patrice's condition wasn't worse than anyone else's, but the sheriff's department weren't staffed to investigate them all. They only advised Patrice on house security, so she put window bars. Cassie knew Patrice was afraid of her stalker, whom she called Big Bastard. She worried about what he would do next. Cassie called Patrice again after her shift. Cassie phoned the police for a wellness check after failing to locate her. A Sierra County Sheriff's Department deputy parked in front of Patrice's house that evening after driving up the lengthy driveway. He knew something was wrong immediately. The house's front door was broken and hanging off its hinges. It seemed like a garden hose had been left on the porch stairs, pouring water everywhere. The deputy exited his cruiser and approached the residence. He turned off the water at the house's side spigot. Then, he climbed the porch's front stairs. He scanned the area for sounds as he moved. He had no notion if the house was still dangerous or what he was entering. He looked through a window before entering through the smashed front door to see what was going on. Blood was his first sight. Just inside the door, blood covered the floor. He unholstered his gun. The deputy entered the residence through the broken entryway with his revolver. He slowly walked across the living room, listening for movement or evidence of someone. But the house was quiet. No one was intruding, but Patrice was missing. The blood in front of the home was all he saw. The deputy went from living room to kitchen. After crossing the threshold, he paused. The room was completely disorganized. All cabinet doors were open. The floor was covered in food, packing, and broken glass jars. The kitchen's far-end window was destroyed, and Patrice's security bars were bent and twisted, dangling on their hinges. The deputy initially missed what was on the floor in the center of the kitchen due to the clutter and devastation. Once his brain digested the sight, he understood he was gazing at Patrice. What was left of her, she no longer appeared human. Her body was mangled. The deputy fled the residence and reported his horrible discovery. Patrice's property was filled with police, crime scene technicians, and forensic experts within an hour. Detectives spoke to Patrice's neighbors as they spread out. The authorities quickly profiled Patrice's killer because practically everyone in the neighborhood had been experiencing the identical break-ins and property damage. The killer was the same person pestering everyone else, they concluded. The police couldn't figure out why. Why did Patrice face such serious violence while everyone else simply experienced minor vandalism? Police were reconstructing Patrice's last day's movements while searching for her killer. At first, they were stuck. It appeared she had only done basic duties that day. They discovered two minor details that explained everything as they investigated those chores. Patrice has been making two bad blunders every day for 2 years. She fed her cats on the porch and dumped her compost in the garden. Big Bastard, her stalker, came to her home because of these two innocent activities. A black bear named Big Bastard. His favorite foods were cat food and kitchen garbage. He eventually considered Patrice food. The bear waited as Patrice fed her pets and emptied her compost for the last time in early November 2023. After waiting until Patrice was asleep, it broke into her house and brutally killed her. The deputy arrived at her home after days of the bear returning and eating Patrice's remains. Black bears rarely attack. Patrice was California's first black bear fatality. The disaster was caused by such absence of perceived risk. Because of this, officials didn't help Patrice or her neighbors with bear complaints. They wondered, what could go wrong? Many thanks for viewing. Comment your thoughts about today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time, see you. The beginning of our story takes place on Chichijima, a small and rough bit of land located in the Pacific Ocean. Situated around 500 miles south of the main Japanese archipelago, this island belongs to the Japanese nation. This island, which appeared to be in a remote location, became of tremendous significance during the Second World War. On that island, the Japanese military had established a military installation, and at the very pinnacle of the island's two mountains, they had constructed two formidable radio towers. In the Pacific theater of the war, these towers were more than simply regular structures. They served as the eyes and ears of the Japanese military. In addition to being essential for communication and surveillance, they enabled the Allies to monitor the movements of their own soldiers and coordinate their own operations. This resulted in Chichijima being completely turned into a fortified location. As many as 25,000 soldiers were stationed on the island when it reached its peak population. It was armed with enormous anti-aircraft weapons, all of which were aimed at the sky and were already waiting. A hornet's nest was the island in question. Chichijima and the radio towers that it contained posed a significant challenge for the United States military. They posed a persistent danger, concealed a weakness in their operations, and provided Japan with a distinct advantage from a strategic standpoint. At this point, the Americans were aware that they needed to remove the island from the equation. The first thing that came to their minds was an all-out invasion. Those responsible for planning and strategy gathered around maps in an effort to determine the most effective method of deploying troops on the beaches. On the other hand, the work appeared to be more difficult the more people looked at it. To put it in the greatest possible terms, military strategists had a strong recommendation against it. The argument that they put out was that any amphibious landing on an island that was so well guarded would be a massacre. They anticipated that the American forces would suffer an intolerable number of losses, and even if they were correct, there was no assurance that they would be successful. It seems highly possible that the Japanese would be able to repel the invasion by digging in and battling to the very end. Not a single concept was pursued. The United States of America then moved on to the next best thing. In the event that they were unable to seize the island, they would blind it. According to the new plan, the 2 radio towers were going to be destroyed from the air. If the communications and monitoring systems on the island were rendered ineffective, the island would lose its strategic value. Therefore, in the month of June in the year 1944, a group of American aircraft carriers, which are essentially enormous floating airfields, made their way towards Chichijima. They formed a steel ring on the ocean, encircling the island in a continuous manner. Pilots from the United States of America started their missions on the decks of these carriers. With the intention of destroying those towers, they continued to launch their aircraft on a daily basis, flying straight into the heart of the island's defenses. However, the Japanese struck back with such vigor that it left the Americans in a state of shock. Suddenly, the sky over Chichijima was filled with anti-aircraft fire, creating a storm. There was a widespread explosion of flak, which was black in color and tore through the air, as well as the fuselages of American aircraft. Attackers were surrounded by a swarm of Japanese fighter planes. It was complete and utter chaos. On a constant basis, the American air raids were unsuccessful, despite the bravery and dedication of the American men. Although they suffered tremendous fatalities, including the loss of planes and pilots, the towers were able to remain standing. After a number of months of these gruesome and unsuccessful missions, the leadership of the American military was becoming increasingly frustrated. Despite the fact that they were aware that it would be a challenging task, they did not anticipate the level of resistance that they encountered. The island had a reputation for being extremely dangerous. In spite of this, the strategic significance of the situation was so high that they could not simply give up. The directives were crystal clear: continue to dispatch pilots until the task is completed. From this point forward, we are now in September of 1944. Once more, the Americans were making preparations for a significant assault on the island of Chichijima. There was a young pilot who was getting ready for the mission while he was aboard one of the aircraft carriers. His name was George, and he was the youngest pilot in the whole United States Navy. He was only 20 years old at the time. The truth was that his age was a lie. George was already a veteran of the military force. Not only had he completed a number of perilous missions, but he had also been shot down in the past. During a previous flight, his plane had been struck, and he had been compelled to eject over the wide ocean. It was a horrific encounter that ultimately resulted in him being rescued from the water. One of the most important and life-saving lessons he had learned from that encounter was one that he would keep in mind in the days and weeks to come. George, along with his 2-man crew, made their way across the flight deck on the morning of the raid. There was a man named Dell, who was his radio operator, and Ted, who was his door gunner, were present. As a result of their previous experience flying together, the 3 of them formed a close-knit team. He was aware of the dangers. They had prior knowledge of the island's reputation, which they were about to target. They boarded their aircraft, which was a Grumman TBM Avenger, a capable torpedo bomber that was not only strong, but also a formidable adversary. Despite the stress that permeated the atmosphere, they went through their pre-flight checks, the regularity that they were accustomed to providing a measure of solace. When the order was received, it was 7:15 in the morning. George and his crew, along with scores of other American aircraft that were participating in the operation, roared to life and took off from the deck of the ship. Almost immediately, George started climbing, and he continued to push his plane higher and higher into the sky. His objective was to reach a height that was greater than 8,000 feet. This was the magic number, the altitude that was widely regarded to be outside the effective range of the Japanese anti-aircraft weapons that were located on the island below. The strategy for the expedition was simple, but it was packed with extremely hazardous elements. When flying over the island at this safe altitude, each and every plane in the formation would fly over it. After that, in order to drop their bombs with precision, they would have to perform a maneuver known as a submerged bomb. In order to get back out of range, they had to draw up and climb as quickly as they could. This meant that they had to lower the nose of their jet, dive steeply towards the target, and get deep below the 8,000-foot safety line. After that, they had to release their bombs. They were put in danger for a few crucial moments as a result of a maneuver that exposed them to intensive enemy fire. George had run missions similar to this one in the past. He had a lot of expertise, and he didn't show any hesitation. The attack dive was initiated by him, making him one of the first pilots in the formation to do so. The landscape below him erupted into chaos as soon as his plane descended below 8,000 feet for the first time. Suddenly, the island was engulfed in flames. They felt as though angry fingers were reaching out towards them from the anti-aircraft weapons, which were tracers. The sky was characterized by the dark clouds that were caused by flak blasts. This was a relentless onslaught of noise and violence, and it was so loud that it was deafening. While George concentrated, he kept his gaze fixed on the radio tower that he had been tasked with destroying. It was almost instantaneous when he experienced a series of intense shudders. A flash appeared on the side of his jet, and he spotted it. It was a blow to them. His controls were examined by him. Even though the plane had sustained damage, it continued to fly. There was a sense of stability. When that split second passed, he was faced with a decision. Either he could cancel the run and attempt to save the jet, or he could click the attack button and finish the mission. The decision to finish the assignment was his own. Over the speaker, he called back to his crew, instructing Del and Ted to hang on to their seats as tightly as they could. At the same time, as he ignored the damage and the unrelenting fire coming from below, he maintained the plane in its steep descent. They proceeded downward, passing through 7,000 feet, 6,000, and 5,000 times. This caused the ground to rush up to meet them. George let go of his burden when he was 3,000 feet in the air, with the radio tower becoming the focus of his attention. 2 bombs, weighing 500 pounds each, were torn away from the aircraft. He observed them for a brief period of time and realized that they had successful. To hit directly, a cloud of smoke and debris rose from the skyscraper as it was being demolished. On the other hand, their accomplishment came at a very expensive cost. The situation with George's plane was extremely precarious at this point. There was a fire that had been started earlier by the hit that he had suffered, and now the aircraft was becoming completely consumed by flames. Smoke was rising into the cockpit of the aircraft. One could hear the engine sputtering. Just about impossible to fly. George was once again yelling at his crew, asking them to hold on, and that he was going to get them as quickly as possible out of there. While he was struggling to bring the nose of the big bomber that was burning up, he jerked back on the control stick with great force. In an effort to get away from the island and into the open water, he started to direct the plane in a different direction. Within a short amount of time, he was able to steer the aircraft in the desired direction and escape the terrifying situation that was Chichijima. He was able to sense the plane's demise. However, there was a rapid decline in their altitude. His prior experience of being shot down came into play at this point in the sequence of events. He recalled with a high degree of clarity what had occurred the previous time and what the experienced pilots had shared with him. In the event that you are forced to make an emergency landing, the most essential rule is to fly as far away from the adversary as you possibly can. If you jump too early, you will end up in the ocean right near to their coastlines without any protection. Within minutes, their patrol boats will be on their way to you, and you will be taken into custody. For many people, being captured was a fate that was even more terrible than death. Since this was the case, George was resolute in his goal to create as much space as possible between his crew and that island. Holding on to the controls, he struggled to maintain the plane in the air for as long as he could, despite the fact that it was in the process of deteriorating. As he continued to fly, he descended more and farther, the waves of the Pacific Ocean drawing nearer and nearer to him. The area inside the airplane was a complete and utter mess. It was becoming more widespread. While he was standing behind him, Del and Ted were shouting at him, telling him that they needed to leap right away. They were able to see additional American planes that had been destroyed as a result of the raid far behind them. The crews of those planes were already evacuating, and their parachutes were flowering in the sky. Yet, George put up a fight. His voice yelled out, "No, hold on!" He continued to travel further and further out into the ocean. He pushed the plane to its ultimate limit till they were so close to the water that it was almost too late to jump at all. He then jumped out of the plane altogether. Not until that point, when he was aware that he was unable to achieve even a single foot of distance, did he issue the command. Jump! George released his grip on the management. He jumped out of the open door of the burning plane and bolted out of his pilot's seat just as the plane was on fire. It was the slipstream that got him as he jumped, and it hurled him against the tail of the airplane. On the back of the airplane, he had a severe blow to the head. He was stunned by the hit, but his training allowed him to recover. The ripcord was pulled by him. It was just a few moments before he struck the sea that his parachute opened, and the unexpected pull of the harness was what ultimately saved his life. So he dove head first into the water. We were taken aback by the icy water. As soon as he came to the surface, he found himself entangled in the lines of his parachute, with the heavy silk canopy threatening to pull him through. In a desperate attempt to get some air, he struggled and eventually succeeded in removing the strap from his shoulders. After pushing the parachute aside, he finally found the time to take a big breath. While he was treading water, he looked about. His jet, the one he had just jumped from, was now utterly empty and out of control, and he saw it for the first time. A few more moments passed before it smashed directly into the lake and vanished beneath the waves. It continued on for a few more moments. It was his crew that he initially thought about. He searched the sky and the water in an attempt to locate Del and Ted as desperately as he could. He was looking for their parachutes, as well as any other indication that they were present. However, he did not observe anything. Not a single other parachutist could be seen anywhere in the vicinity. His stomach dropped. Suddenly, he became aware of an astounding occurrence. It was a miracle that the life raft that was intended to deploy automatically from his plane had somehow landed in the ocean barely 10 feet away from him. Without a doubt, that was a stroke of absolute luck. He swam straight to the inflatable raft and pushed himself inside, his body aching and fatigued from the effects of the swim. He immediately returned his attention to his guys as soon as he entered the room. He began calling their names, his voice becoming hoarse as he did so. He yelled their names over and over again, "Ted!" Del, but did not receive any response. The only thing that could be heard was the sound of the wind and the waves. They did not appear to be present. He twisted around on the raft, and his gaze drifted back towards the island of Chichijima, which was now a faint shape on the horizon. He was looking at the island. He then became aware of it. This was the realization of his darkest nightmare. It was possible for him to observe a number of tiny boats moving quickly away from the island. The vessels were Japanese patrol boats, and they were moving at a high rate of speed in the direction of his location. He was well aware that they were seeking him and any other American airmen who had been shot down. His body experienced a wave of adrenaline. No one was going to be able to take him in. After making a complete turnaround, he positioned himself so that he was lying on his chest at the front of the raft and began paddling with his hands. As he attempted to get away from the boats that were approaching, he sank his hands into the water and pulled with every ounce of power he had left. Throughout the entire ordeal, he continually yelled out for Ted and Del, hoping against hope that he would eventually locate them. Nevertheless, he was unaware of the awful reality. Both of his crewmen had perished in the incident. They had not been able to get out of the plane at all, and as a result, they had perished along with the plane. Despite the fact that the second individual had jumped, his parachute did not open. Only George was present. The muscles in his body were burning as he paddled as hard as he could. After a while, he continued to stare behind him. As the boats approached, they got closer. He was aware that he could not outrun them. There was no way out of the predicament. At a certain point, the tiredness could no longer be tolerated. It dawned on him that he would not be able to locate his companions, nor would he be able to flee the situation. He simply sat up in the raft and stopped paddling at that moment. He turned around and shifted his attention to the police boats as they got closer to the area. He was aware that they would arrive at his location within a few minutes. He was about to be taken captive. His thoughts began to move at a breakneck pace. When it came to Ted and Del, he was overcome with feelings of remorse. He started to have second thoughts about his choice to keep the jet in the air for such a long time and to force them to make their escape so late. He pondered the possibility that I had been responsible for their deaths. He pondered his wife back at home and pondered whether or not he would ever have the opportunity to see her again. He shifted his attention back to the Japanese boats, which were now considerably closer to him, and started mentally preparing himself for a life of imprisonment or even worse possible circumstances. But at the same moment when he was about to give up all hope, he heard the noise of motors coming from above. When he looked up, he saw a formation of American planes soaring through the aerial space above him. Due to the fact that this was a fighter escort, they were not members of his initial raid group. As they swooped by him, they submerged themselves in the water and headed straight for the Japanese boats. They began firing their machine guns as the patrol boats were being strafed by the fire. They detonated bombs that caused enormous water plumes to be released into the atmosphere. When the quick and severe onslaught from the air occurred, the Japanese boats were totally concentrated with surviving it. This caused them to be thrown into pandemonium. George was unable to believe his good fortune. He was given the opportunity. Trying to escape the conflict that was taking place behind him, he turned around, got back on his chest, and began paddling once more. He paddled as quickly and as forcefully as he could, hoping to get away from the situation. Paddling for the next 2 hours was George's activity. He put as much distance as he could between himself and Chichijima by using every last bit of his power and every ounce of his determination to live. He did this in order to maximize his chances of survival. But in the end, his body was unable to continue. It was impossible for him to raise his arms and paddle one more time because he was so utterly and completely fatigued. After collapsing onto the raft, he was left hanging aimlessly in the huge ocean that was devoid of any life. While he was lying there for some time, he became aware of a peculiar sound, which he described as a mild whirring noise coming from beneath the water. With his head raised, he surveyed his surroundings. He then became aware of it. In close proximity to his raft, the periscope of a submarine was seen breaking the surface of the sea for the first time. It turned out to be an American submarine. Just a few seconds later, the submarine itself surfaced right next to him. Following the opening of the hatch, the crew emerged onto the deck. After grabbing him from the raft, they brought him onto the submarine and placed him inside the vessel in a secure manner. He was spared from death. In addition to George, Ted, and Del, there were 8 more American servicemen who were forced to escape their damaged aircraft with the assistance of a rescue helicopter during the same operation. For a considerable amount of time, the official narrative stated that these 8 individuals were never found again. As a result of the fact that they were reported missing in action, the general consensus was that they had simply perished while at sea. However, that was not the real event that took place. The government of the United States of America was able to determine the facts in a relatively short amount of time. Nevertheless, these specifics were so terrible and so absolutely horrific that they made a decision. They came to the conclusion that they would not reveal the truth to anyone. They were especially adamant about not informing the members of these 8 airmen's families, including their wives and parents. The administration was of the opinion that the families would be unable to tolerate the severity of the situation if they were to confront the truth. All of the information regarding what transpired with those 8 men was therefore seen to be of the utmost importance. The truth was concealed there. For a period of 60 years, the secret was retained. The families of those guys went to their graves with the mistaken belief that their sons had been lost at sea. In 2004, however, a writer by the name of James Bradley began conducting research for a book. During the course of his investigation, he came upon a collection of documents that had reached the declassification stage. The transcripts were from a Japanese war crimes trial that had been held on the island of Guam after World War II. The trial had been held in the aftermath of the war. According to these transcripts, Japanese military officers who were caught admitted in their own words to the specific actions that they had taken against the 8 American airmen who were taken captive. Eventually, the truth of the matter was going to be revealed. These 8 other airmen had bailed out practically quickly after their planes were hit over the ocean, in contrast to George, who had flown his jet as far away from the island as he could possibly get it. This indicated that they landed in the ocean in close proximity to the coast of Chichijima. Therefore, before any American rescue planes could rush in and save the day like they did for George, Japanese patrol boats had hurried out and scooped all 8 of them out of the water. This was done before any American rescue planes could come in. Having been taken as prisoners of war, they were brought back to the island. Their circumstances were really precarious. Over the course of several months, the Japanese forces stationed on Chichijima had been subjected to a continuous bombardment. They had witnessed the deaths of their colleagues and fellow service members at the hands of the very American aircraft that these airmen had been flying. It was clear that they harbored a profound and raging hatred for the Americans, and they desired to exact their vengeance. In addition, all of a sudden, they found themselves in possession of 8 American hostages on their island, entirely at their mercy and with no one to protect them. Immediately after that, there was a complete and utter plunge into barbarism. After being taken into custody, the 8 individuals were gathered together in a temporary prison area within 24 hours of their capture. A Japanese commander entered the area and pointed his finger at one of the individuals who were present. He went by the name of Marv Marchant. His hometown was Long Beach, California, and he was of the age of 19. Marv was abducted by the soldiers, who then hauled him away from the group and brought him to a central location within their military establishment. At that location, they bound him to a tree. After that, the commander urged all of the other soldiers stationed at the base to vent their frustrations on the defenseless prisoner. Over the course of the entire day, a constant stream of Japanese soldiers approached Marv and repeatedly beat him. They hit him with whatever they could find, including punching him, kicking him, and generally hitting him. Marv was unable to stand up for himself because he was bound to the tree and unable to move. In addition, the 7 other American detainees were compelled to watch the entire event without having the ability to break the chain of command. On that particular evening, the same commander returned. Untying Marv, who was severely injured and barely awake, from the tree, he freed him. He instructed the remaining 7 captives to remain in their current location. Marv was then led away from the party and into the dark jungle by the commander, who was accompanied by several other Japanese soldiers. They took him by foot to a location where a burial had already been dug when he arrived. An individual who was a Japanese soldier and was clutching a long sword was seen standing near to this recently dug tomb. The instruction given to Marv was to stroll to the edge of the pit. They forced him to get down on his knees in front of it. A cigarette was presented to him as a parting gift as a final gesture. The testimony indicates that Marv smoked the cigarette in a well-composed manner. After he had completed his task, the individual who was holding the blade covered his eyes with a blindfold. Following that, he instructed Marv to forward extend his neck. After Marv had finished speaking, the soldier raised the blade and proceeded to behead him. After that, they buried him by transporting his body to the grave and burying it there. In spite of this, the horror was not yet ended. Yoshio Tachibana, a Japanese general who held one of the highest ranks on the island, was one of the individuals who was there in his quarters on that particular night. There was little doubt that Tachibana was an alcoholic, and he was notorious for his nasty and sadistic inclinations, particularly toward those who were incarcerated. As he was lounging around and drinking with his officers, he had an idea that was so heinous that it was beyond comprehension. According to his perverted thinking, there was only one way for his soldiers to genuinely demonstrate that they possessed what he referred to as the fighting spirit. He announced that his soldiers needed to demonstrate that they possessed this fighting spirit by ingesting human flesh. This resulted in Tachibana issuing a horrifying command. His soldiers were instructed to return to the jungle, locate the shallow grave, and exhume the body of Marv Marchant. He gave them this instruction. Then, Tachibana dispatched one of his surgeons to the scene. Therefore, he gave the surgeon the order to remove Marv's thigh. Surgically removing the thigh muscle, the surgeon went to the body and performed the procedure. Afterwards, he handed it over to one of the cooks. In order to provide the general and his high-ranking officers with a substantial lunch, the cooks utilized the meat that was taken from Marv's thigh. As well as Tachibana and the others, they were served it. As stated in the admissions that were presented during the trial, they consumed it with soy sauce and accompanied it with sake. In addition, it appears that they took pleasure in it to such an extent that Tachibana gave orders to his soldiers to return to Marv's body and remove further meat, which they did. The act of cannibalism that was committed was not a one-time heinous murder. Some of the other officers, including Tachibana, held the belief that it was a superstition. They were under the impression that consuming the flesh of their adversaries would not only make them more powerful, but would also be beneficial to their digestive systems and their overall health. Approximately 1 month after Marv's execution and consumption, Tachibana made the decision that he desired more. More human flesh was something he wanted his warriors to consume. On account of this, they came to the conclusion that they would not only kill more of the American prisoners, but also consume them. 7 of the surviving American detainees were carried out to the island's rifle range for their final examination. When all 7 of the prisoners were arranged in a line, one of the Japanese officers approached and grabbed Floyd Hall, a 25-year-old man from Missouri. They separated him from the rest of the party, led him to the center of the shooting range, and then bound him to a stake made of wood that had been driven the entire way into the ground. The order was given by General Tachibana, who was present to keep an eye on the situation once Floyd had been secured. It was his instruction to the other Japanese soldiers that they should practice their bayonet on Floyd Hall. Before Floyd ultimately succumbed to his wounds, the soldiers approached him one by one and repeatedly stabbed their bayonets into his chest and stomach. This continued until Floyd was unable to recover from his injuries. It was specifically for this reason that Tachibana had taken his surgeons along with him. It was immediately after Floyd had passed away that he dispatched the surgeons to the field. The 6 surviving convicts were terrified as they watched the surgeons cut up Floyd's body and extract his liver and gallbladder. The physicians did this in full view of the prisoners. In order to ensure the organ's preservation, they were wrapped in cellophane paper. Due to the fact that they were aware that this was not the final execution of the day, the surgeons made their way back to the edge of the field and placed themselves there. The remaining 6 prisoners looked around in a state of terror, wondering who would be the next person to be taken. Another one of the captives was reached by a commander who walked over and grabbed them. He went under the name of Earl Vaughan. Born in Texas, he was 22 years old at the time. Immediately after the troops grabbed him, Earl was aware of what was going to happen. After seeing what they had done to Floyd, he came to the conclusion that he did not want to experience the same thing. He consequently grew defiant. It was his desire to pass away, but he desired to pass away more rapidly. As he approached the Japanese soldiers, he began yelling "Semper Fi," which is the motto of the United States Marine Corps. By repeatedly extending his neck and pointing to it, he was conveying the message that he desired a swift and uncomplicated execution. It was his desire for them to behead him. The Japanese attempted to secure him to the wooden post with the intention of allowing the other soldiers to engage in additional bayonet training with him. However, Earl put up such a strong fight that it was impossible to overcome. The man continued to struggle and put his neck out, demanding that he be severed from his head. One of the soldiers eventually gave up, pulled him down to his knees, and then proceeded to behead him as a means of putting an end to his life. And once more, the surgeons rushed out onto the field to perform their examinations. They removed Earl's liver and gallbladder and wrapped them in cellophane paper while they were in plain view of the 5 American captives who were still being held. The cooks prepared the organs of both Floyd and Earl that night, and all of the high-ranking Japanese officers who were stationed on the island feasted on them when they were ready. Within a short period of time, the remaining 5 captives were also put to death in a manner that was comparable to the brutality of the executions, usually in front of their fellow soldiers. Additionally, 2 of the remaining 5 were consumed by the Japanese officers and were consumed by them. On the other hand, the Japanese devised a fate that was even more monstrous for one of those 2 remaining men. Prior to his execution, they did not carry it out. Rather than that, they kept him alive while surgeons amputated various parts of his body through surgical procedures. They would first cut off a limb, then transfer it to a place where it would be cooked and consumed, and once they had finished, they would return for more. The reason they did this was to ensure that their meat remained as fresh as possible. They proceeded to cut off more and more pieces of him until there was an insufficient amount of flesh left for consumption. At that precise moment, the imprisoned individual was finally put to death. In the aftermath of the war's conclusion, the Allied forces initiated the process of prosecuting those who had committed war crimes. For the war crimes that they committed against these 8 American prisoners of war, 34 Japanese soldiers from Chichijima, including General Yoshio Tachibana, were brought before the court for trial. They were all found to be responsible. Following their execution by hanging, their bodies were laid to rest in unmarked graves on the island of Guam. All of them had been sentenced to death. In addition, other men on the island who had witnessed the atrocities but had done nothing to stop them, or who had participated in a secondary role, were also tried for war crimes. Despite the fact that they were all sentenced to prison and found guilty, they were all released after serving only 8 years in prison. What about George, the young pilot who was saved by the submarine? What happened to him? He had reached the age of 80 when he was finally able to acquire the complete truth regarding the atrocities that took place on Chichijima Island, the fate that he had narrowly avoided. Following the publication of James Bradley's book, the narrative was made available to the general public. When George heard it, he felt the same horrified and deeply disturbed feelings that everyone else did. In addition to everything else, however, he experienced a profound and enduring sense of guilt. He experienced the feelings of survivor's guilt because he was the only one who had survived the ordeal, while a large number of other people had to endure such an unimaginable end. Nevertheless, one thing that we can all agree on is that George did not squander the second chance he was given in life. The pilot, George H. W. Bush, who was only 20 years old at the time, would go on to become the 41st President of the United States of America eventually. Furthermore, his son, who was also named George Bush, would go on to become the 43rd President of the United States of America. If George Sr. had jumped out of that burning plane near Chichijima Island just a few seconds earlier, two world leaders who would change the course of history forever would never have existed. These two leaders would have changed the course of history forever. Give that some thought. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you saw today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up?